Campfire Girls in the Country, or The Secret Aunt Hannah Forgot, by Stella M Francis. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Chapter 1. A Country Town 4th of July. It was the 4th of July throughout the Western Hemisphere, and in all other portions of the earth where the midnight second of the 3rd had ticked and passed. It was emphatically the 4th in the United States, including the eastern town of Fairbury, a municipality of some 3,500 inhabitants. On this day there were considerably more than 3,500 men, women, and children in the place, and a cosmopolitan gathering of country and town folk it was. Artisans, merchants, professional men, farmers, laborers, and their wives and children or sweethearts. It was a gala day for dress, millinery, chatter, peanuts, popcorn, lemonade, ice cream soda, toy balloons, bazoos, and squawkers. Everything but firecrackers, which had recently been legislated a national nuisance. The gathering place for this great concourse of every kind and description of humanity inhabiting the town and the country round about was the public square. And a typical public square it was. In the first place, it was truly square, for it had been thus sited and staked by the original surveyor. And along the lines thus staked, representative businessmen and capitalists had constructed some 2,000 feet front of store buildings, which were occupied by the most cheerful aggregation of citizens in the town. In explanation of this characterization of these citizens, we must cynically observe that all of them had something to sell. This square boasted of one skyscraper, 3 stories high. Most of the other mercantile buildings were 2 stories high. This skyscraper was the pride of the town, a really well-planned and well-constructed building, with pressed brick south front and east side, located on the northeast corner of the square. The First National Bank occupied the first floor of this building. In the center of the square was the county courthouse, sections of which were occupied by officials of the municipality in lieu of a city hall. This building, a massive turreted pressed brick and stone structure in the center of a neatly terraced lawn, enclosed by a chain fence, had the distinction of possessing a town clock tower that arose to a loftier height than the skyscraper and rivaled the Methodist church steeple 3 blocks away as to loftiness above the sea level. The church, by the way, stood on a considerably lower site, or this rivalry would not have been possible. Well, the patriotic crowd moved here and there around the periphery of the square and back again, or around and around and around, while the peanut and lemonade vendors called out their wares, and a phonograph over the entrance of a motion picture theater sung ragtime music to attract the attention of the amusement seekers. The more quietly disposed of the congregated populace, however, sought the restful convenience of the courthouse lawn or the refreshing protection of a dozen shade trees standing along the line of the chain fence. Others, especially the younger element, not quite so staid of demeanor, moved hither and thither, sometimes with the stream of gay-spirited and gaily attired humanity around the square, sometimes upon the lawn, where they would gather in social groups around the bandstand, and sometimes upon the battlement-like balustrades and porticos of the elaborate exterior of the courthouse. Among this younger element were 13 girls in khaki middy suits and light brown sailor straw hats, whom the whole town knew by this time as the full membership of the Flamingo Campfire. These girls, for more than a week, had been visiting at the home of Mrs. Hannah Hutchins, an odd character past the prime of life, but withal a kindly disposed and interesting widow, who owned a considerable estate a quarter of a mile east of the city limits. To readers of this Campfire series, the faces of these girls are at once familiar. They are the wood gatherers, fire makers, and torch bearers, whose experiences during the last preceding Christmas holidays constituted the motive of interest in another volume entitled Campfire Girls in the Allegheny Mountains, or A Christmas Success Against Odds. Those experiences were of a character so remarkable, so thrilling, as to render this campfire an organization of no slight distinction, not only among wearers of the emblems and badges of the craft and chanters of Wahalo cheer, but even with the public at large, for nationwide publicity had been given to their adventures in a coal mining district where their mission of charity had met with extreme opposition from certain unprincipled men. Indeed, it is not too much to say that these adventures had been the chief subject of discussion among the members of the fire, except perhaps the immediate affairs of their daily life, during the entire second semester of the school year. Then came another and longer vacation, 10 weeks in the summer. What should they do during this period? Was the question that held their attention more and more as the year's schoolwork at Hiawatha Institute drew nearer and nearer to a close. For 2 weeks after it was first broached, the problem remained unsolved. Then Hazel Edwards created a buzz of interest by laying before her associate flamingoites a proposition just received by her from a relative living alone with 3 or 4 servants and farming assistants on the wide and picturesque country seat she had inherited from her late husband. This relative was her Aunt Hannah Hutchins, who had taken a fancy to Hazel when the latter was a little tot in rompers, and her interest in her niece had not lessened with 14 or 15 years of age. "She wants us all to come and stay as long as we care to," Hazel announced. "Aunt Hannah has been kind of lonesome, you see, since her husband died, and she's always begging her favorite relatives and friends to come and visit her. She likes young folks especially. We'd have dandy places to camp, and I bet Aunt Hannah would be just tickled to death to come out and camp with us. She's just that kind. A little odd at her age, but you wouldn't notice that after you got acquainted." The proposition was taken up seriously. Then followed a period of correspondence between the girls and their parents. The latter were more cautious than usual in their inquiry into the vacation plans of their daughters, and well they might be, for had not these 13 girls in their last midwinter holidays excursion been snatched at the 11th hour right out of the jaws of tragedy by a band of hurriedly organized rescuers? But at last the consent of the fathers and mothers of Flamingo Fire was obtained after it had been shown that Fairbury was a quiet little city, populated chiefly by retired country folk, and that Aunt Hannah's farm contained no such menaces to human life and comfort as precipices, open mine shafts, poison ivy, savage dogs, kicking horses, and distempered cattle. After a week at their several homes following the closing of school, these 13 Campfire Girls reconvened by invitation of Hazel Edwards on an agreed date at the semi-wilderness country seat of odd and interesting Aunt Hannah. And so we find them all on this 4th of July afternoon in 2 or 3 groups on the lawn and on the massive stone portico of the west entrance of the courthouse, chatting among themselves or with other girl acquaintances they had met since their arrival, while the kinetic picture of human life moved round and across and betwixt and between, and the vendors called their wares, and the band played, and the Japanese tumblers tumbled, and the skyscraper scraped with staid dignity, undisturbed by the inharmonious mixture of soulful music, reckless gaieties, spendthrift patriotism, a wealth of national colors, and a general confusion of nondescript noises. Chapter 2. Aunt Hannah's Indignation. Aunt Hannah was present on this occasion, but she did not attempt to be a girl with the girls. One thing Aunt Hannah knew, if she didn't know anything else, so she said, and that was how to keep where she belonged. Middle-aged women, she declared, should not seek the company of younger folk, although they could with good grace accept the society of girls of all ages, if it came to them gracefully and with juvenile interest. "In other words," she said, "an adult should be unto children like a magnet. If I can't draw the young folks to me as an object of interest to them, I'd better seek the company of dried-up grown-ups or live the life of a hermit." Now, the members of Flamingo Campfire did like Aunt Hannah from the first day they met her. They liked her especially because she invited them to come to her home for a vacation period, and then didn't try to force her adult notions and habits upon them. She gave them the freedom of her place, told them to live in the house or pitch their tents wherever they chose, and then permitted them to go their way as it might please them. The result was, they never forgot Aunt Hannah's comfort and ease and interest whatever they might have in mind to do. So Aunt Hannah was with the girls on this 4th of July. As this narrative opens, we find her seated on the lawn in company with Miss Harriet Ladd, guardian of the fire, Ruth Hazelton, Ethel Zimmerman, Ernestine Johansson, Helen Nash, Azalea Atwood, and Marion Stanlock, about 100 feet from the performing platform of the Japanese tumblers. Hazel Edwards, Harriet Newcomb, Estelle Adler, Juliet Hyde, Marie Crismore, Catherine Crane, and Violet Monday, the other members of the fire, were grouped with several local schoolgirls on the large and massively balustraded portico of the west entrance of the courthouse. Suddenly the attention of everybody within view was directed to a disturbance and a congestion of the crowd toward the southwest corner of the square. A fight was the word passed along, and those of sporting proclivity rushed toward the center of interest. The chief of police, a man of official lonesomeness under ordinary circumstances, and his half a dozen specially sworn-in deputies all hastened toward the scene of trouble. Those on the courthouse lawn and on the portico and table-like balustrade, from their more elevated positions, could see more distinctly than the rest of the crowd of patriotic celebrators what was going on. Two men were evidently engaged in a physical combat of no little violence, and the policemen were having their troubles in attempting to get room enough to make their official efforts effective. If the battle had been between the Monitor and the Merrimac, the crowd could hardly have pressed forward more eagerly. "Did you ever see anything like it?" Aunt Hannah commented for the edification of those near her. "The way the people will run to see a fight! I don't know of anything that will prove Darwin's theory any better than that. There is no doubt in my mind that our way-back ancestors lived in a jungle, and who'd deny after seeing that sight that a lot of us ought to be there now?" "Good for you, Mrs. Hutchins!" exclaimed Adolph Helfinger, a farming character well known in the community, who was one of the score or more of persons that heard the woman's biological criticism of fight-loving humanity. "It does beat all how things do get impressed on people's minds. I never had any use for that there monkey theory, but I'll be switched if I don't believe there's something to it now. It's just as plain as daylight. If people wasn't sprung from monkeys, they wouldn't always be making monkeys of themselves." Everybody in hearing distance of these two speeches laughed heartily. The Campfire Girls on the courthouse portico, observing that the group on the lawn had become a center of interest that counteracted the depressing and unsavory effect of the fight, left their position and joined Aunt Hannah's group. "What's the joke?" inquired Harriet Newcomb, as she and the other girls with her distributed themselves here and there on unoccupied portions of the seating capacity of the lawn. "That is an impertinent question," replied Aunt Hannah with mock severity. "If some of you exclusive people would drop your exclusiveness and seek the company of bright folks, you'd be more likely to be on hand when something interesting turns up." "Very well," Harriet acquiesced gravely. "We'll sit right down with you and wait for something more that is brilliant to happen. I do really hope it will come pretty soon, for that big crowd of fight fans over there gets my goat." "Why, Miss Newcomb," Aunt Hannah exclaimed as if deeply shocked, "aren't you ashamed of yourself to use such slang in my presence before you know whether I approve of it?" "Don't you approve of slang, Mrs. Hutchins?" asked Catherine Crane. "Now, don't you try to put me to any such test as that, 'cause I won't fall for it," the demure madam answered. "That is getting away from the issue. This is not a question of slang, but of diplomacy. I am very fond of diplomats, Miss Newcomb." "Oh, I knew you weren't very unfriendly toward slang," Harriet replied positively. "I don't believe in diplomacy when I am sure of my ground." "You talk like an old head," Aunt Hannah commented admiringly. "I am only 17," Harriet flashed back with the dignity of youth consciousness. "But I'm old enough to understand that diplomacy is made up chiefly of camouflage fibs." "What are camouflage fibs?" inquired Azalea Atwood. "You are forever springing big words on us, Harriet. Now make good and explain this one." "Camouflage," the challenged girl began, having in view a scholarly discourse on the French origin of the idea in European warfare. Then she stopped suddenly and fixed her attention on something that was taking place a few feet from the temporarily unoccupied Japanese tumbler stand. Every other person in the group, dominated by Aunt Hannah and the Campfire Girls, followed with their eyes the direction of her gaze. "There's another fight, Mrs. Hutchins," Harriet continued, changing her subject to fit the occasion. "I'm going to keep still and give some of the bright folks a chance to produce something interesting." Yes, two men were engaged in a pugilistic demonstration that looked like the beginning of another unsavory sensation. The cause of their hostility toward each other was not apparent, but at the start had the appearance of being about as ridiculously unequal as it well could be. One of the men was not more than 5 feet 6 inches tall and slight of stature. The other was over 6 feet and built like an athlete. A cry of indignation went up from hundreds of throats as the large man was seen to reach forward suddenly and give the smaller fellow a slap on the face that could be heard 200 feet away. "Villain!" exclaimed Mrs. Hutchins, with high indignation, and the sentiment was echoed in like manner from many other quarters. Chapter 3. Aunt Hannah's Loss. But the villain did not have everything his own way. After the resounding slap administered on the face of the smaller man, there followed a sparring match that proved to be the biggest thriller of the day's celebrations. It all happened so quickly that before a crowd could gather closely enough to hamper their movements, the two men were staging a mill the like of which for speed had probably never been witnessed in that town before. The little fellow made one savage leap at his antagonist in return for the latter's resounding salute on the face, and from that moment until the fight was finished, his feet seemed scarcely to touch the ground. He appeared to be able to hit his opponent wherever and whenever he pleased. He was plainly a master of the art of springing, ducking, sidestepping, lunging. The crowd, observing that here was a rare exhibition of great skill, opposed to vast superiority of weight and strength, kept back at a respectful distance in order that the smaller man might have free play. But thousands of men, women, and children on the square, however, pressed forward to witness so unusual a scene, forming a dense circular wall of sightseers. On the inner rim of this circle stood Aunt Hannah, Miss Ladd, and the 13 members of Flamingo Campfire. For 15 minutes the pugilistic performance continued, the larger man being the aggressor most of the time, but receiving all of the punishment. If any of the policemen who had stopped the first fight returned to the scene of this engagement, no attempt was made to interfere. The skill and speed of the little fellow seemed to create a popular demand that so novel a contest be permitted to go to a finish. Possibly the guardians of the peace realized the overwhelming sentiment in favor of a sportsman's fair play, and discreetly kept the strong hand of the law in their pocket. The big fighter swung viciously, desperately, again and again at his clever little foe, but in vain. The latter brought cheer upon cheer from the throng by cleverly dodging all these attacks and answering them with such agility of foot, body, and hand work that a skilled referee would have had difficulty in estimating the number of successful blows he succeeded in landing. Once the bantam fighter dodged right between the legs of his enraged antagonist and upset him, to the almost insane delight of the crowd. This seemed to be the turning point of the mill. The thoroughly whipped bully evidently had had all he wanted and was looking for some means of getting away from his physical and moral embarrassment. While he was thus casting about for an avenue of escape, the spry little scrapper was dancing all around him and raining blows almost wherever he pleased, while the big victim shielded his head with his arms and the crowd fairly howled with delight. Suddenly the defeated fighter broke away and ran, his punisher pursuing close at his heels. As a sprinter, the winner of the bout proved also to be the superior of his late antagonist. The latter lumbered away like a groggy longshoreman. Suddenly the vanquisher of superior weight and muscle made a spring like that of a wild beast and landed on the back of the fugitive. The latter staggered, stumbled, almost fell, then began running around in a wabbly circle, while the onlookers pressed back, eager to give way for a continuation of the exhibition as long as possible. Finally the affair reached a climax when the jockey scrapper shinned up the back of his victim and stood erect for perhaps a minute, while the human horse struggled, staggered, and actually groaned in distress, and the crowd screamed itself hoarse. The scene was closed when the hero victor leaped lightly from the shoulders of the exhausted bully and refrained from making further attack. The defeated man slunk away in the crowd, while his conqueror, with an affectation of modesty, also managed to slip away and was seen no more by the hundreds of curious citizens and hero worshippers who longed for just one glimpse of this human wildcat when not in action. The members of Flamingo Fire fairly held their breath during much of the performance. So tense was their excitement, as quite naturally it should be, that each of them was scarcely conscious of anything else, in action or being, other than this sensational affair. They were all waked up finally by this exclamatory remark from Mrs. Hutchins. "Well," followed by a pause for the exhaling of a long pent-up breath. "That's the nearest I ever came to seeing a prize fight, and I hope I never come any nearer." "I bet that was a part of the day's entertainment," declared one of the wise whites of the town who was standing near. "Nobody can tell me such a thing as that could take place without being staged ahead." "They wouldn't dare," Aunt Hannah returned positively. "The town wouldn't stand for such a disgraceful put-over as that was." "You can't tell what the town will stand for until it's put to the test," retorted the keen-headed individual. "It seems to me that everybody was pretty much delighted over the affair, judging from the enthusiastic noise they made." "Aunt Hannah, where's your handbag?" Hazel asked suddenly. Mrs. Hutchins looked down at her hands and then up again in astonishment at her niece. "Why," she exclaimed, "where is it? I had it in my hand." Then she began an examination of the lawn near where she stood. "And my pocketbook's gone!" exclaimed Ernestine Johansson after a search in the pocket of her middy blouse. "Mine's gone, too," was the startling announcement of Violet Monday. Then Ethel Zimmerman capped the climax of sensations by declaring, "Somebody has taken my diamond lavalier." "There are pickpockets in the crowd," screamed a woman a short distance away, who had discovered her handbag wide open and the money section emptied of its contents. Presently another woman picked up Mrs. Hutchins' handbag and identified it by a name card inside. She turned it over to its owner, who announced after examining it, "There was $15 in it, and it's gone." Then suddenly she began a nervous, hurried search in the handbag, as if moved by the recollection of something vastly more important than the missing $15. The look of despair that came over her face as she took out the last remaining article was sufficient evidence that her search was unsuccessful. With a gasp she seized her niece's arm for support, exclaiming, "Oh, Hazel, it's gone, it's gone! What will I ever do? Oh, I must find it! I must find it! I must find it!" Chapter 4. A Startling Discovery. "What's the matter, Aunt Hannah? What have you lost?" Hazel inquired with deep concern, moved by her relative's agitation. But Mrs. Hutchins' distress was even greater than at first it appeared. Fearing that she was about to faint, two of the girls took hold of her arms to support her. Evidently she was in need of this assistance, for her weight rested heavily on them. "Somebody call a taxi and we'll take her home," Hazel requested. No further effort was made at this time to learn what was the article whose loss had so unnerved the now unhappy woman. It was not necessary to call a taxicab, for Mrs. Hutchins's friends were numbered almost by the population of the town, and a machine belonging to one of the leading citizens was offered for service. Hazel, Marion Stanlock, and Helen Nash accompanied her in the automobile to her home. Mrs. Hutchins rallied considerably soon after the machine left the crowded square, and began a nervous, half-hysterical discussion of the developments of the day. "I bet there was a regular army of pickpockets in that crowd," she said. "I bet, too, that you'll find they were scattered all over the square and worked like beavers during the excitement. You just see if a very large number of people weren't robbed." "And the very thing happened that they needed to make their work easy," Marion suggested. "I wonder if it really just happened," said Hazel dubiously. "I can't help feeling that there was something mighty funny in that fight. We girls have had a good deal of athletic training at school, and while they don't exactly make acrobats out of us, we know something about balancing ourselves under difficulties. Now, I don't believe that little fellow could have remained balanced on the shoulders of the larger man unless—" Hazel hesitated. The other passengers of the automobile gazed at her expectantly. "Unless what?" Helen asked. "Unless there was collusion?" "Exactly," Hazel replied, just a little relieved at the removal from her of the responsibility for the audacious idea that really was in her mind and seeking expression. "But you know cowboys can hang on to a bucking bronco until it is tired out," reasoned Marion, who was less inclined to suspicion. "Yes, and they can do that only after long practice," Hazel answered quickly. "And what man, I don't care how athletic he may be, can balance himself standing on the shoulders of another man who is trying to throw him off? I don't believe even a circus rider could do it." "You mean that the whole performance was a fake?" Aunt Hannah inquired. "Yes, or a part of the day's program." "No, that wouldn't be allowed any more than a genuine prize fight," Marion objected. "I think you're right," Hazel assented. "But what was the reason for putting over such a gigantic fake?" Marion asked. "It might have been to give the pickpockets an opportunity to get their work in," was Hazel's keen suggestion. "My, I can hardly believe it," Marion exclaimed. "I'm not saying positively that any such audacious trick as that was planned, but I won't dismiss the idea until the thing is fully explained," Aunt Hannah declared. All of the girls returned to Mrs. Hutchins' home for supper, for although they had a camp with tents pitched and everything in complete outing order, arrangements had been made for feeding and housing them indoors that night so as to obviate laborious details that might hinder them from getting the most possible from the day's celebrations. Moreover, there was to be a grand display of fireworks at the lake in the evening, and everybody had planned to be on the scene as early as possible. Aunt Hannah recovered rapidly from the nervous shock she had received, following her return home in company with 3 of the girls. But still she was evidently depressed by the loss she had suffered, and announced that she would not go to the lake to see the fireworks. "I think I'll stay here with you, Auntie," Hazel announced at the dinner table. "No, you won't," Mrs. Hutchins returned quickly. "You'll go out with the other girls and have a good time. It'll be all right. Nothing the matter with me, only a little upset. I've got a good appetite and my digestion's fine." "But I don't like to leave you here alone," Hazel insisted. "What do you think I'd do if you girls weren't here?" inquired the rebellious patient. "Haven't I got Minerva, the best housekeeper on earth, here with me, and couldn't she shoo away anything from a ghost to a nightmare? You Campfire Girls have got the notion that nobody can do anything quite right except yourselves. But I want to inform you that there are others in this world, especially when it's your duty to unload some of the world's burden from your shoulders and enjoy yourselves. Ain't it so, Minerva?" The latter, a sleek, jolly-faced colored woman who was engaged in serving peaches and devil's food cake for dessert, showed her appreciation of the honor of reference to her as an authority by replying heartily, "'Deed it is, Mrs. Hutchins. They sure ought to go and see them there fireworks, 'thout peradventure of any doubt. I just naturally want to stay with you here alone, missus, and don't want no one hanging around what ought to be enjoying themselves." "How about you, Minerva? Wouldn't you like to go and see the fireworks yourself?" Hazel asked. "Now, bless your heart, child, you do make some funny propositions. The very idea! Me see fireworks! And as she laughed, her loosely knit avoirdupois shook comically. This merry discussion relieved considerably the strain of the day's doings, so that the misgivings of the girls at the prospect of leaving their hostess alone with the faithful colored housekeeper were considerably allayed. Mrs. Hutchins kept up a general appearance and manner of cheerfulness, although several times Hazel wondered if this appearance were not produced with great effort, as she observed her aunt apparently lapse into momentary despondency. But if the girl was not mistaken as to appearances, Aunt Hannah successfully disarmed suspicion each time by some light remark or gaiety of manner difficult to associate with depression of spirits. So the girls all went to Lake Ellen, a pretty sheet of water half a mile long and a furlong wide, resting comfortably in a platter-like depression between the southeastern edge of the town and a succession of wooded hills. In the course of the events of the evening they heard many references to the sensational affair of the afternoon, and learned that the number of persons known to have been robbed had been growing hourly, until the stories that were being circulated had become almost unbelievable. Many watches had been taken, valuable necklaces worn by women had disappeared, and scores of pocketbooks containing amounts from a few cents up to $200 had been taken from the pockets and handbags of men and women. The members of Flamingo Campfire returned to Mrs. Hutchins' home about 11 o'clock that night, filled with awe at the grand scale on which the operations of the pickpockets had been conducted. Aunt Hannah had prepared sleeping quarters for the girls before they arrived at her home, and directed them to make use of these accommodations whenever, for any reason, they desired a change from camp life. So on this occasion they all knew their places and reached their several bedrooms without delay or confusion, and without disturbing the other occupants of the house. Hazel and Harriet Newcomb together occupied an upstairs room at the east end of the long Dixie-like frame house. 15 minutes after their return from the evening celebration they were in bed, and the general quiet throughout the place indicated that the other girls also had retired. They fell asleep almost immediately, but did not slumber undisturbed until break of day. Hazel was the first to open her eyes. Her first conscious sense was one of alarm. Then she found herself wondering if she had had an unpleasant dream. She recalled the principal events of the 4th of July celebration and attempted to convince herself that the repulsive fight she had witnessed was only a nightmare, but the delusion did not remain with her long. She looked toward the east window and observed the yellow moonlight streaming in like atmospheric gold. As the reality of things dawned upon her, she recalled the fact that some very distinct creaking noise, as of the swinging of a door, had awakened her. Almost at the same instant the sound was repeated, and with a thrill of apprehension she almost sprang out of bed and hastened to the window and looked out. The first glance over the moonlit yard brought nothing remarkable to her view except the beauty of the mellow scene. which, however, she was in no frame of mind to recognize. The kitchen was around on the north side of the house, but a curved walk leading from this entrance wound around a flower bed to the east and off toward a gate near the automobile drive. Keeping her eyes on this view, Hazel listened intently for further noises downstairs. Suddenly, from the shadow of the house to the north, appeared the form of a woman clad in a loose robe and with nothing on her head. Hazel was so startled for the moment that she retained only slight control of her senses, and it is small wonder that she gave a sharp gasp of astonishment. The woman was Aunt Hannah. Chapter 5. Locked Out. "Hazel, what is the matter? What in the world are you doing?" This inquiry, coming from Harriet, who had been awakened by Hazel's awed exclamation, caused the latter to turn half around, although she retained her position at the window. Her friend was sitting up in bed. "Come here, quick," Hazel urged in a strange, almost hollow voice. Harriet was soon at her side and following with her eyes the direction indicated by her companion's finger. She saw the form of a woman, scarcely clothed for an out-of-doors excursion, even in the middle of the night, and with her uncovered hair hanging loosely over her shoulders. "Why, it's your aunt!" Harriet exclaimed. "What is she doing? Where is she going?" "I don't know," Hazel replied. "I must go out and see." "I'll go with you," the other girl volunteered. "We'll put on our tennis shoes and kimonos and slip on our cravenetted raincoats. That'll be enough, and try to catch her before she gets away from us," Hazel said. "Come on, quick." In a second, both girls were executing this dressing program with greater rapidity than they ever before had engaged in any proceeding of like character. After it was completed, they hastened downstairs and out the back way. The night wanderer was no longer in sight, but while dressing, Hazel had kept watch through the east window and observed the direction her aunt was taking. She saw her pass through a gate leading into the orchard, and then lost her as the shadow of a large apple tree obscured her from view. Hazel led the way from the rear entrance to the orchard gate. As they passed through, Harriet inquired, "What do you suppose she is doing? What could have caused her to come out here at this time of night?" "It's a hard thing for me to figure out," Hazel replied with as much deliberation as was consistent with her rapid movements. "But one possible explanation has occurred to me." "What's that?" "I'm afraid yesterday's experience and the loss she says she suffered have affected her mind." "Oh, I hope not," Harriet deplored sympathetically. "So do I, but I'm afraid it's something of that kind." They were now running along a path that led them through the midst of the orchard toward a timber of 20 or 30 acres in extent directly to the east. Near the far edge of this timber, the girls' camp was located, and the pursuit was leading them directly toward it. The orchard covered about 3 acres, consisting principally of large apple, peach, cherry, and pear trees, most of them many years old. As the two girls were running through this place, Harriet inquired of Hazel, "Have you any idea what time it is?" "Yes," was the reply. "It's 20 minutes after 2. I slipped on my wristwatch as we were dressing, and I looked at it when we got out in the moonlight." "Where do you think your aunt has gone?" Harriet continued. "That's pretty hard to say. About the best we can do is to follow this path. That's what she was doing when she disappeared from my view." At the east edge of the orchard, the girls found another gate which opened into the timberland. They passed through and continued their way along the path that wound among the trees in a general easterly direction. The timber was fairly clear of deadwood and underbrush, so that there was little obstruction to their progress. Finally, the followers of Aunt Hannah came to the edge of a small clearing, which was crossed by the path, and were about to slip into the open when Hazel stopped suddenly and seized her companion by the arm. "There she is," she said in a warning whisper. But Harriet saw the object of the attention of her friend almost as soon as did the latter, and it was unnecessary to stop her. She stood still and awaited instruction what next to do. It was not long coming. "Let's hide behind these bushes and watch her," Hazel proposed. She led the way and Harriet followed. The bushes were only a few feet from the path, and in a few seconds the girls were concealed behind them and peering cautiously out at the advancing woman. Mrs. Hutchins passed so close to the watchers that they could see the features of her face distinctly in spite of the shadows of the trees. The look in her eyes was not wild or insane, as both girls feared it would prove to be. It was calm, somewhat troubled, and meditative. But there was something more in the expression of her face that thrilled Hazel and Harriet with a good deal of awe. Apparently she was unconscious of her surroundings, although she seemed to have sufficient command of her senses to pick her way in a kind of subconscious manner. "She's asleep," Hazel whispered. "Be careful, don't wake her, as it might scare her nearly to death. She's probably going back to the house. Come on, we'll follow her." The two girls returned to the path and followed Mrs. Hutchins at a distance of 25 or 30 feet back to the orchard gate, through the orchard, still along the path over which they had made their way to the timber, and into the east yard of the home of their strange hostess. The circular dome-roofed garage was near the path a short distance from the orchard gate, and in the shadow of this they waited, at Hazel's suggestion, until Aunt Hannah got into the house. They feared to advance in the open through the yard while the somnambulist was opening the door, lest she turn and see them and perhaps awake. After the sleepwalker was inside and had closed the door, the girls waited 5 minutes or more to give her time to get back into bed before they ventured to advance to the kitchen entrance. Meanwhile, they watched the east window of Aunt Hannah's bedroom to see if she would turn on the light, but there was no illumination through the shade, and they assumed that she had returned to bed in the dark. As soon as they deemed it safe to re-enter the house, Hazel and Harriet walked briskly up to the door. Cautiously, Hazel took hold of the knob, turned it, and pushed the door. An exclamation of surprise, almost of dismay, escaped her lips. She stepped back, and with a look of startled helplessness announced, "She's locked the door. We're locked out." Chapter 6. Braving the Spooks. "What'll we do now?" Harriet asked with a look that might have appeared comical to one not threatened with the necessity of staying out the rest of the night. "It never occurred to me that she might do such a thing," said Hazel, without attempting to answer her comrade's question. "But I don't know what we would have done if it had occurred to us. We would have gone in with her, and we couldn't have got in first very well unless we had run on ahead of her as soon as we saw her headed back for the house." "Shall we try to get in through one of the windows?" Harriet suggested. "And run the risk of being shot as burglars?" returned Hazel with a nod of grim fatality. "I happen to know that Aunt Hannah keeps an automatic pistol for that very purpose, and she knows how to handle it like a man." "Then we must stay out till morning," said Harriet rather dolefully. "I'm afraid so, unless you can make your wits work better than I seem to be able to work mine." "Let's ring the bell and wake somebody up," Harriet proposed. "We'd probably wake everybody up, and then there'd be a lot of explaining to do. Aunt Hannah'd probably be present clamoring with all the rest for an explanation. What reason could we give that would sound plausible for being out in this attire at this time of night without telling a great big fib? We'd probably get ourselves in bad doing that." Harriet saw the reasonableness of this argument, but she was not ready yet to give up. Of course, they must get back into the house, without revealing the occasion of their going out if possible, or if not, they must do the best they could. "Let's go around to Marian and Helen's window and wake them up by throwing pebbles against the glass," was her next proposal. "They'll come down and let us in. Fortunately, their room is at the opposite end of the house from your aunt's, and they're not likely to disturb her." "That sounds pretty good," Hazel said, somewhat encouraged. "Let's go around and see how things look." They hastened to the west end of the house, but the conditions they found there were anything but favorable. In the first place, the moon was in the southeast, so that the shadow of the house darkened a considerable area of ground to the west. Moreover, a large oak tree completed this disadvantage by throwing a dense shade on the ground near the southwest corner of the house. "They'd never recognize us in this place," Hazel objected, after a hasty view of the surroundings. "If we succeeded in waking them up, we'd do nothing better than scare them. They'd think we were burglars or maybe ghosts." The latter suggestion with a little shivering laugh, although it was a warm night. "It isn't funny," Harriet observed with almost a shudder, although she laughed derisively, "that we should think about ghosts with the chills running up and down our backs on an occasion like this, although we know there ain't no such things. My, I'm beginning to feel creepy. I could almost have sworn a spook touched me on the shoulder just then." "Harriet!" exclaimed Hazel reprovingly, while she cast an apprehensive glance behind her and then looked back foolishly at her companion. "The first thing we know you'll have a fit of screaming. Now quit that kind of talk and think up something more sensible for us to do." Both girls lapsed into silence several moments, and at length Hazel said, "I believe the best thing we can do is to go back through the woods to our camp and stay there the rest of the night." "But we'll be up against the same difficulty in the morning of explaining away our predicament that we'd be up against now if we woke up somebody to let us in," Harriet objected. "No, we won't," Hazel replied. "Not if you let me do the explaining. I think you're afraid we'll meet a ghost in the timber." "You're just trying to get back at me," Harriet said defiantly. "Go ahead, lead the way, and see if I'm afraid of all the spooks in the timber. But how will that explain our going to the camp at this time of the night?" "I won't say when we went. I'll just say we went." "But why?" "To find out if there really are any ghosts around here. I'll say you gave me a ghost stare and I took you up. That'll be true, won't it? You started by putting me to the test. Now I take you up. Come on." Without more ado, Hazel started around the north side or rear of the house and led the way along the route over which they had passed twice in the last hour. Harriet followed, asking no more questions, although several which seemed to her of considerable importance persistently puzzled her mind. For instance, she wondered how her audacious leader would explain to the other girls and Mrs. Hutchins how the door happened to be locked from the inside after they had gone out. Again, how would she explain the hasty attire in which they had made their departure? Moreover, what excuse would she give to Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, the persons in charge of their camp, during the absence of the girls, for this unheralded appearance and resumption of possession? "Hazel as much as asked me to let her handle this affair, and I think I'll let her do it from now on," Harriet mused. "It isn't a matter of life and death, I guess, for anybody concerned. If she bungles things up, I'll have the laugh on her." Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie lived in the farmhouse belonging to the estate and ran the farm for Mrs. Hutchins. When the Campfire Girls arrived and pitched their tents down by Butter Creek and Fern Hollow, they were delighted with the suggestion that they take charge of the place whenever the campers wished to be absent. The prospect of occasional tent life during the next few weeks had no little charm for this childless couple, to whom life usually had a good deal of uninteresting sameness day after day. And the delight of this innovation in their experiences became the more substantial when Aunt Hannah purchased an extra tent and told them to pitch it near the colony of the Campfire Girls and occupy it whenever their regular duties did not require their presence elsewhere. Mrs. Hutchins wisely suggested that perhaps it might be well to have a man within calling distance, inasmuch as tramps and other troublesome characters now and then were seen in the neighborhood. Nothing of the kind, nature or description of a spook or a ghost, was seen during the trip through the woods to the camp in Fern Hollow, and in half an hour Hazel and Harriet finished their night's adventure by closing their eyes in slumber on 2 comfortable mosquito-protected cots in the colony of tents of Flamingo Campfire. Chapter 7. Letting Hazel Explain. Fortune and careful calculation favored the plans and purposes of Hazel and Harriet at the break of day. They had stolen quietly into their tent and into bed without arousing the sleeping Mackenzies. Under ordinary circumstances, after losing so much sleep, both girls would have slept until long after sunup. But with the present necessities working on their minds, there was no need of an alarm clock to arouse them before it was too late to make their departure unobserved. Hazel awoke first. The sun had already chased the moon shadows into a ghostly retreat, and a multitude of day beams, sliding aslant from the brilliant east, were piercing the foliage with glittering, colorful effects. One glance through the canvas flaps in front of the tent was enough. Hazel turned and was about to put her hand on her companion to awaken her when the latter opened her eyes and sat up. "Quick, Harriet," she whispered. "We must hurry. It's getting late. We must get back to the house as soon as possible. Maybe we can slip in without being noticed." But this urging was unnecessary. In a few minutes both girls crept under the side of the tent farthest from the one occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie and hastened off toward the trail that led back to Mrs. Hutchins' house. Fortunately, neither the farmer nor his wife had yet risen, as they were still within their tent. Hazel and Harriet arrived back at the house without notable hap or mishap, and went direct to the kitchen entrance. They were surprised as well as pleased to find the door unlocked. With curious anticipation they entered, Harriet holding back a little in order that her companion might take the lead, and saying to herself, "She asked me to let her do the explaining, and I'm going to do it." "Well, for the Lord's sake!" This was the first greeting the girls met with which indicated that any of the occupants of the house had arisen from the night's rest. Of course, it was uttered by Minerva, who came out of the dining room just as Hazel and Harriet entered the kitchen. "Where in the wide world did you young misses come from?" the colored servant continued. "Oh, we've just been out for an early morning constitutional, Auntie," Hazel replied. "My land, how industrious you folkses be, a-studying your history lesson in vacation and at 5 o'clock in the morning." "History lesson? What do you mean by that?" Hazel inquired. "What do you s'pose I mean?" Minerva returned with erudite dignity. "Does you chillens think I don't know the Constitution of the United States am a mighty important part of history?" The girls laughed merrily. "Why, Minerva," Hazel exclaimed enthusiastically, "who would ever have thought you would penetrate our secret so cleverly? But now that you are in on it, we want you to help us out and keep our secret with us. We don't want the other girls to know what we are up to." "Bless your heart, child, I'll do anything for you," Minerva declared in a voice whose sincerity could not be mistaken. "Thank you, Minerva," Hazel said with amused earnestness, as she and Harriet passed into the hall on their way upstairs. They got back into their room without further personal encounter, and there congratulated themselves and each other on the successful manner in which they had run the gauntlet of difficult circumstances. "I must say you managed it fine," was Harriet's admiring compliment to her friend as she closed the door. "And you didn't tell a single fib." "Oh, yes, I did," Hazel insisted, "or something of the same character. I boosted along Minerva's historical misunderstanding and thereby told a constitutional fib." An hour and a half later, Minerva rang the first call for breakfast, and in a short time Aunt Hannah and all the members of the Flamingo Fire were gathered around the capacious fume-doped table in the large dining room. While they were eating, Mrs. Mackenzie, matron of the camp, called and, without particular ceremony, as was the custom in the Hutchins household, was ushered into the presence of the assembled guests. She had an announcement of interest to them to make. "I found this wristwatch in one of the tents this morning," she said. "Oh, it's mine!" exclaimed Hazel eagerly. The next instant she would have given a good deal to be able to recall the identification. But what was the use, was her next mental argument. If she denied ownership, someone would recognize it and she would find herself in a difficult position. "I forgot it and left it under my pillow," she continued. "Thank you ever so much, Mrs. Mackenzie." The latter delivered the article of jewelry to its owner and then continued, much to the discomfort of Hazel and Harriet. "Excuse me for interrupting you further, but there were some strangers in one of the tents last night. I'm afraid they were tramps. They slept there, for this morning the beds were all disarranged. I know all the beds were made yesterday. I don't think they took anything. Luckily, they didn't find that watch under the pillow." This statement produced a commotion among the breakfasters. Uninvited visitors in their camp? What were they? Tramps? Gypsies? Mrs. Mackenzie said she did not know. She merely considered it her duty to report conditions as she had found them. She would maintain a more careful watch in the future. Then she departed. As the matron left the breakfast room, Ethel Zimmerman created no small embarrassment for both Hazel and Harriet by saying, "Hazel, how in the world did that wristwatch of yours get down there in your tent last night? I'd swear I saw you wearing it yesterday afternoon. I noticed it particularly after my diamond lavalier was snipped off my neck." Chapter 8. Back to Camp. Whether Hazel would have been able to dodge this issue and avoid the unintended trap that it contained if Aunt Hannah had not come to her rescue is uncertain. Of course, Aunt Hannah had no such purpose in view, but it was very natural for her to remark under the circumstances with dry, humorous reproach, "Now, Ethel, are you sure that you didn't see double? Those were pretty exciting times yesterday, and it was quite possible for one to make a million mistakes." This afforded Hazel a pretext for diverting the conversation along another line. "By the way," she said, "is there a morning paper published here?" "No," replied her aunt, "only an evening, or rather two of them, the Times and the Journal. There is a good deal of rivalry between them, and the Journal got out an extra last night with metropolitan headlines on the sensation of the day." "I heard some boys calling the papers for sale but did not get one," said Hazel. "How did you happen to know about it, Auntie?" "Oh, the Journal called me up and asked for full information as to what we lost. You were here, Hazel, when they called. You heard me talking over the phone about it." "Yes," said Hazel. "I had forgotten, but remember now. I don't believe I knew who called you. I think I thought it was the police." "Well," continued Aunt Hannah, "they got out quite an edition. Some scoop for a small town, believe me. I had a messenger bring me a copy." "Where is it?" Hazel asked. "On the table in the living room, I think," Aunt Hannah replied. "Excuse me, girls, if I'm all impatience, but I can't eat any more breakfast until I've seen who had their pockets picked and so forth," Hazel declared. "I suppose several Campfire Girls got their names in the paper." With this announcement, she left her omelet and popovers and skipped through the portiered arch into the next room. In a moment she was back with the paper in her hands. "Listen, girls, here are the big headlines," she announced. Then she read as follows: "Sensational fight as pickpockets trick. 2 score of crooks invade Fairbury, hypnotize the town, and carry off immense swag. Many pockets picked, much jewelry stolen, scores robbed, too. Thieves escape in automobiles." Everybody let breakfast get cold, while Hazel read the 2 columns of thrilling description of the affair that had enraged the whole town. The evidence was declared to be conclusive that an organization of confidence men, perhaps some of the smoothest in the country, had plotted the whole performance with a view to producing the very results that followed. The number of individual losses of money and other valuables suffered by citizens and visitors had not yet been estimated, but apparently it was several hundred, judging from the complaints on every hand. The cash drawers in 9 stores were opened and emptied, the loss here being nearly $2,000, as the receipts of the day had been large. The news story carried the names of over 60 persons who were known to have lost money and other valuables. Among these were Mrs. Hutchins, Ernestine Johansson, Violet Munday, and Ethel Zimmerman. The statement of their losses was accurate, except as to Aunt Hannah, who had said nothing to the reporter about any loss sustained by her aside from the $15 taken from her handbag. Consequently, no reference was made in the paper to this mysterious loss. After breakfast, all the members of Flamingo Fire returned to their camp and resumed outdoor life. Before leaving the house, however, they renewed their standing invitation to Mrs. Hutchins to join them any time she wished, and she promised to do so later in the day. Fern Hollow is the beginning of several miles of beautiful scenic depressions and elevations in the hilly country east of Fairbury. The site of this town is comparatively level. Most of the hilly expanse was either covered with timber or suited to grazing. Mrs. Hutchins' farm included about 200 acres of this kind of land, and also some 60 acres of fairly level and more tillable soil. A stream of water of more than the average depth and width of country creeks flows in fitful rapids and calms along the uneven bed the entire length of the hollow. This stream is the main outlet of Lake Ellen, which is fed by numerous springs and spring water rivulets on 3 sides. Years ago it was given the name Butter Creek by some facetious patriarch, perhaps, because of the extravagant amount of churning it had to do along the course of more than half a mile after it left the lake, or, to be absolutely fair, in honor of the herds of milch cows who browsed among the multitudes of buttercups that grew along the banks. The camp of Flamingo Fire was a short distance up the fern-decorated hillside from Butter Creek, about a quarter of a mile from the lake. This site was selected because of its beauty, which exceeded even that of the picturesque scene along the lake shore. 9 white canvas tents pitched close together on the side of the hill comprised the shelter of the camp. One of these tents was the kitchen and commissary headquarters. Another was occupied occasionally by Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, particularly while the girls were absent any considerable length of time from the camp. The other 7 tents were the sleeping quarters of the 13 members of the campfire and their guardian. Most of the ferns of Fern Hollow were in the lower part of the ravine or gully, many of them along the banks of Butter Creek. Here and there, near the stream, were small meadow-like areas where buttercups grew in rich abundance, variegated with a plentiful sprinkling of violets, shooting stars, anemones, cowslips, and sweet williams. Much of the scattered tree growth near the stream was stunted and bushy. Farther up on either side of the creek, the bushes were larger and thicker, and the arboreal growths more substantial. Altogether, this little valley, with its picturesque surroundings, was a beautiful sight, and undoubtedly would have been exploited by revenue seekers as a summer resort if the lake above had been large enough for extensive boating, bathing, and fishing. But even under present conditions there was fishing for the town in both the lake and in numerous pockets of the creek, while certain boys living in the vicinity maintained a boathouse and 2 or 3 boats for their own use, and at a small fee by the hour for the occasional public. Several years before, an enterprising individual with more enterprise, money, and imagination than sound business judgment attempted, in a small way, to establish a paying summer resort in this place. He leased a site and privileges from Mr. Hutchins and erected a sort of pioneer hotel of decidedly rustic aspect and a dozen portable cottages. He operated the place 2 seasons, enjoying a considerable patronage, but his expenditures exceeded his income to such an extent that he found it necessary to discontinue business in order to avoid bankruptcy. The portables had been removed, but the hotel, a small affair, made principally of logs, was still standing. To the girl campers, from the day of their arrival in Fern Hollow, this long-deserted hostelry was an object of no small interest. It was covered with vines and moss and surrounded with a dense growth of small trees and shrubbery. Over one end drooped a huge cottonwood tree, which had grown with a considerable lean toward the building. This tree, which was over 100 feet tall and 5 or 6 feet in diameter at the base, undoubtedly was no more than a sapling at the time the hotel was constructed. One of the first objects of the Campfire Girls' exploration in the hollow was this renatured fiasco of civilization. Perhaps the fascination of the love that nature seemed to have for this object of poetic desolation had something to do with their selection of a camping site within a few hundred feet of it. At any rate, their first visit to the old log house resulted in unexpressed resolutions on the part of the visitors to come again. The interior was in a remarkable state of preservation. Even the floors were fairly sound, and the steps leading from the first story to the second, after a little repairing, could be climbed with safety. The first weekly meeting of the campfire was held one evening in this place. There was a huge fireplace in the main room on the first floor, and in this the girls built a roaring fire which lighted up the room in a picturesque manner. This fireplace and the entire chimney constituted one of the most substantial elements of the building, being constructed of boulders of all sizes laid in Portland cement. Into these surroundings the members of Flamingo Campfire returned following the apparent closing of the incidents that signalized the most eventful 4th of July any of them had ever known. There had been nothing inspiring in these experiences, and every one of the girls hoped heartily that they would have no more of this nature. When people go camping, as a rule, about the last thing they expect is a thrilling sensation of any sort. But the future of these girls seemed to be mapped out with promises of startling events, the one hopeful feature of which recognized their apparent ability to pull through with triumphant success. Chapter 9. Dissect and Analyze Gossip. 4 days of delightful camp life in and about Fern Hollow served to alleviate to a large extent the disturbing effects of the 4th of July experiences of Flamingo Campfire, so that the girls became sufficiently composed and confident as to the future to congratulate themselves on the return of normal conditions. The day following the 4th was Thursday, and until well along in the afternoon, the main topic of conversation was the shocking affairs that interrupted the patriotic celebrations. But the more they discussed it, the more unsatisfactory were the results, until finally Miss Ladd, the guardian, swung the whole matter around for an entirely different view from a new angle. "Girls," she said as they seated themselves in a shady spot on the bank of Butter Creek, about a mile downstream from the camp, "I have permitted this talk to go on as long as it has with a purpose in view. I could see plainly where it was leading to. Nowhere, confusion. Now I want to call your attention to what has been uppermost in your minds during all of your discussion of this affair. It is this: sheer curiosity as to who lost money and other valuables in yesterday's unscheduled event and the individual amounts or articles lost. This curiosity has popped up here and there along the line, and where you had the desired information, you turned it over and over and over and inside out to be certain that no feature of interest escaped your attention. Moreover, this purposeless curiosity has served to dissipate your day's outing. It has unsettled you to such an extent that you have wandered here and there with little idea of what you wished to do except to get out and flap your wings. Now my suggestion is that henceforth you taboo that affair as a subject of discussion, at least except here and there incidentally, until there is some real occasion for its coming up again. In other words, train yourselves to throw off any sensation as soon as you see that it is leading you around in a circle all the time." "In still other words," broke in Ernestine Johansson, "you caught us in a vertigo of gossip and thought you would let us go to the limit so that we couldn't help looking foolish when you called our attention to what we were doing. Girls, I'm ready to admit with all of you that we have been foolish. Let's vote the subject into oblivion until there appears to be a chance of it getting us somewhere." "I second the motion," said Violet Monday. "All in favor say aye," proposed Estelle Adler. There was a chorus of ayes. Contrary, no. Not a no was uttered. Carried unanimously. The subject is taboo. "Here comes an automobile," announced Azalea Atwood, a moment after this subject had been disposed of in a parliamentary manner. All eyes were turned in the direction indicated. A highway ran through the timber a quarter of a mile downstream, and the driver had opened a gate and driven into the clearing, which extended almost up to the place where the Campfire Girls were resting. It was difficult for the driver to find a passageway over the acreage of tree stumps, and undoubtedly he would have found the task impossible if he had not kept close to the bank of the stream. The auto had not traversed half the distance between the road and the resting place of the girls before Hazel recognized it and exclaimed, "Oh, that's Aunt Hannah. It's her machine. She must have been up at the camp and learned from Mrs. Mackenzie where we were." Hazel's surmise was correct, as Mrs. Hutchins explained after leaving the automobile and joining the girls. "What have you been doing all day?" she inquired. "Oh, just tramping around and getting lots of fresh air and exercise and," Hazel said, and as she hesitated for a completion of her sentence, Harriet Newcomb finished it for her thus, "and gossiping." "Gossiping?" repeated the woman with a glance around of not very severe reproval over the glasses that pinched her slightly aquiline nose. "I'm surprised. What were you gossiping about?" "What happened on the 4th and who were the victims of the pickpockets and thieves," Hazel replied. "Why was that gossip?" "I don't suppose it was at first, but finally we got to the end of our string, and there were only two things for us to do: stop or go all over it again. Well, we didn't stop, and the first thing we knew we were going round and around in a circle." "Yes, and we did a lot of gushing over it, didn't we, girls?" interposed Marie Crismore. "I was one of the offenders, I admit it. When we got worked up to a high pitch of feeling, some of us would cry out, 'Wasn't it awful? Wasn't it terrible? Did you ever hear anything like it?'" "Yes, that's real gossip," Mrs. Hutchins agreed, taking off her poplin automobile hat and settling herself as comfortably as possible on a grassy spot, which two of the girls cleared for her by removing a scattered litter of dead twigs. "And that brings to my mind a very interesting subject. Did you ever ask yourselves just what gossip is?" "It's tattling, tale-bearing, idle talk," volunteered Juliet Hyde, who had made considerable study of the dictionary for classwork. "We had to study up on that when we were reading Much Ado About Nothing in English." "All right, you're just the girl I want to quiz," said Mrs. Hutchins with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "By the way, I used to be a school teacher myself." "Yes, Aunt Hannah used to teach in a country school, didn't you, Auntie?" said Hazel. "That I did, right on the outskirts of the village of Podunk, although that wasn't its name," she replied. "And do you know, girls, with all due respect to the advanced character of the highbrow institutions of today, I believe I learned some things in the middle ground between here and the backwoods that few people learn here. For instance, I believe I acquired a broader understanding of gossip than the average critic of gossip." "Hooray! I believe Mrs. Hutchins is going to give us something new," Harriet Newcomb interposed, leaning forward eagerly. "Wait till you hear what I have to say," suggested Aunt Hannah. "I may have some questions to ask to find out if you get me. My experience has taught me that the average critic of gossip gossips when he criticizes." "There, "What did I tell you?" Harriet exclaimed. "Did anybody here ever hear anything like that before?" Apparently nobody had. "All right, Miss Newcomb," continued Mrs. Hutchins. "Now I am going to put some questions to you. Do you believe what I said is true?" Harriet gazed thoughtfully a moment or two at her inquisitor, then replied, "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Well," the girl said slowly, "much criticism of gossip is gossip because it hasn't any particular purpose in view. It consists usually of passing remarks just like gossip, other gossip, if you please." "It sounds better as a rule, doesn't it?" Mrs. Hutchins inquired. "Yes, but it's only a little higher class of gossip, unless you can offer some suggestion that will get the gossips busy on something that will keep their minds off of gossip." "Very good. Now, will you tell me how many kinds of subjects there are in the world that one can gossip about?" "As many subjects as there are in the world," Harriet replied quickly. "I've heard people gossip about the European war and about the weather. That was when they just wanted to say something, but didn't know anything about their subject." "How is it possible for one to gossip about the weather?" "Oh, goodness, I've done that lots of times," Harriet confessed, smiling reminiscently. "But that was before I became a Campfire Girl. I used to be complaining about the weather all the time, saying what a cold, wet, hot, uncomfortable day it was. That was gossip, pure and simple. It didn't get me anywhere. I didn't know what to do to make me comfortable. But the Campfire organization has solved the problem of weather gossip and many other kinds of gossip. Why, our exercises, our studies, our many little occupations that we work out are just the things we need to keep us from criticizing everything that doesn't rub like velvet against us. Do you know, really, that a hot day isn't hot when you're deeply interested in something?" "That is simply fine," declared Mrs. Hutchins with deliberate emphasis on each word. "I surely didn't expect a lecture like that from so young a girl. If there are many others who can say such things, I'll have to take back what I said about getting a broader understanding of gossip than the average critic of gossip. You even added something to my view of the matter when you introduced the subject of meteorological gossip." "I didn't know that I—" began Harriet. Then she stopped and admitted her bewilderment with a puzzled look on her face. "What is meteorological gossip?" Hazel asked. "Can't some of you girls figure it out?" Aunt Hannah inquired with a searching look into the face of every one of her young guests. "I can't," several of them admitted. "If Harriet can't tell you what it means, there's no hope for a definition from Flamingo Campfire," said Violet Monday. "She knows more big words than all the rest of us put together." "Don't be in too big a hurry to confess ignorance for the entire fire," Miss Ladd interposed quickly. "If none of you girls can answer that question, I think I can." "Isn't all gossip like a meteor?" inquired Azalea Atwood so naively that both Miss Ladd and Mrs. Hutchins laughed heartily. The others, still being in ignorance on the subject of meteorology, failed to catch the joke. "The trouble is, Azalea," said Miss Ladd, "that you have a limited understanding of the word meteor. You are thinking of it as a ball of fire flying across the heavens at night. That is a specific meaning of the word. The general meaning, not popularly understood, is any phenomenon of the atmosphere, such as rain, snow, hail." "If it rained frogs and angleworms, the frogs and angleworms would be meteors," suggested Julietta Hyde. "Surely," Miss Ladd replied with an accent of disappointment. "However, Julietta, by that suggestion you are getting the other girls off the track. Now, can't somebody answer the question?" "Oh, I know what it is!" suddenly exclaimed Violet Monday, clapping her hands eagerly. I remember reading the other day that the weatherman of this section is one of the most skilled meteorologists in the country." "Then what is meteorological gossip?" Mrs. Hutchins asked. "Gossip about the weatherman," Violet replied, but the chorus of laughter that greeted her definition proved she had missed her opportunity. "It's gossip about the weather," cried several of the girls, and both Miss Ladd and Mrs. Hutchins looked very well pleased. "Now," said Aunt Hannah, "I've delayed an important matter longer than I should have delayed it. I really came here on a meteorological mission, not gossip. The weather report that reached Fairbury today predicts a storm for tonight. It is likely to be a pretty severe one with a strong wind. I thought I had better come here and suggest that you girls come back to the house for the night." "Campfire Girls are not afraid of storms," said Ruth Hazelton warmly. "Not much, are they?" declared Ernestine Johansson. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Hutchins, but I for one am in favor of sticking to our tents. I like a thunderstorm." "So do I, with lots of lightning in it, but not too near," said Catherine Crane. "Let's invite Aunt Hannah to stay with us," Hazel suggested. "Just as you say, girls," said Mrs. Hutchins. "I'm not afraid if you're not. Only I thought it might be more comfortable in my house." "Campfire Girls don't always look for comfort first," vouched Ethel Zimmerman. "If there's going to be a storm, we'd better hurry back to camp and see that everything is ready for it," Miss Ladd suggested. Mrs. Hutchins instructed the driver to take the machine back to the garage. Then she and the campfire prepared for their walk back up Fern Hollow along Butter Creek to the place where the little colony of tents were pitched. Chapter 10. An Unwelcome Caller. Half an hour later they were back in camp and busy getting everything in condition for the expected storm. Mrs. Hutchins said that the weather report which reached Fairbury that morning read thus: "Rain tonight. Strong wind from southeast. Not much change in temperature." She had a Philadelphia newspaper, too, which contained a long weather story telling of hurricanes on the Atlantic Ocean and heavy storm-laden winds blowing inland. Hope was expressed, however, that the force of the winds would be pretty well broken before they got far in from the coast. The sky was still clear, and there was no indication as yet of any impending disturbance of the elements. Hardly a breath of air was stirring. The sun was still well up in the heavens. The day was warm but not oppressive. The first work of the girls on their arrival back at the camp had to do with securing the tents against possible tearing loose by a strong wind. Every guy rope was tested, as well as the hooked pegs in the ground to which they were fastened. Special attention was given to the guy ropes attached to the flies, which were intended to protect the under canvas from the wind and the rain, and to smaller ropes that held the drop flaps close to the ground to prevent the rain from beating in. After this work was completed, 3 of the girls began the preparation of supper. All the members of the campfire did duty in shifts in the kitchen, and this was their day. The supper of creamed dried beef, potatoes, peach sauce, cocoa, and bread and butter was over early, and the dishes, principally aluminum, were washed and put away. Still there was no sign of the storm promised by the weatherman. The sun was 2 hours high, and the girls decided to gather a supply of wood with which to build a bonfire at dusk. It was not to be a ceremonial fire, so everybody, wood gatherers, fire builders, torch bearers, got busy. In half an hour Miss Ladd called enough, and the industrious gatherers of dead and dying tree limbs contemplated with satisfaction the abundant results of their labor. "That ought to make things look pretty cheerful after we light a match to it tonight," said Miss Ladd. "Unless we have a regular cloudburst, all the water that falls on that bonfire will go back up in steam." "It'll make it pretty hot around here," Catherine Crane suggested. "Maybe it won't be so bad if the rain cools the atmosphere," said Helen Nash. But the weather report said, "Not much change in temperature," Ethel Zimmerman reminded. "Oh, that has no reference to the cooling of the atmosphere by rainfall," said Marian Stanlock. "For instance, you can cool the atmosphere in your home by turning the hose on the front porch, but by doing that you don't lower the temperature as the Weather Bureau looks at it." "Well, we'll drive the mosquitoes away and keep the bats at a distance," Hazel Edwards suggested. At this juncture, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of an automobile moving along the drive that ran from the main road half a mile away through the timber to the abandoned hotel. As it stopped, a man stepped out of the machine and advanced toward the group of Campfire Girls. He was a middle-aged man of medium height and weight, with a stubby sandy mustache and wearing a light gray suit and a Bangkok hat. "I am looking for Mrs. Hutchins," he announced, lifting his hat and bowing with an urbane ease that seemed to indicate a kind of professional society practice. He waited for a reply, still in an attitude of conventional politeness. "I am Mrs. Hutchins," said Aunt Hannah, rising from a camp chair on which she had been resting from her walk while the girls gathered firewood. "I hope you will excuse this intrusion," said the man, advancing a few steps nearer and still holding his hat in his hand. "But I came to Fairbury from Baltimore especially to see you on important business, and I was told at your home that you might not return to the house for 2 or 3 days. I could not very well wait that length of time, so hired an automobile and came here." The other members of the camping party, realizing that the business interview sought by the man might require privacy, withdrew to a respectful distance. Then suddenly Hazel pointed off toward the southeast and said, "See there, girls? That must be the storm coming up over the horizon now." The others looked in the direction indicated, and there was a chorus of concurrence in Hazel's suggestion. Evidently the clouds were moving very rapidly, for even as the girls looked, it seemed that they could see the white fringed rim of heavy black sky mist growing larger every moment. "There's a mighty strong wind behind those clouds," said Miss Ladd. "I'm afraid we'd better not build a fire tonight. If it should prove to be a big windstorm without much rain, it might do some serious damage when it got to playing with the fire." While the other girls were occupied in watching the storm, Hazel stole a glance at her aunt and the unexpected visitor. For some reason that she could not explain, she felt that the man was there for no purpose friendly to Aunt Hannah, and her glance toward them in no wise tended to allay her suspicion. The two were engaged in earnest conversation, and the woman's attitude evidently was a physical reinforcement of a vigorous protest. With a little shudder of apprehension, Hazel was about to turn about and rejoin the girls in their conversation about the storm, when Aunt Hannah motioned to her as if beckoning her to approach the spot where the interview was taking place. The girl did as requested, and as she came within a few feet of her aunt and the stranger, she heard the former say to the man, "That is absolutely all I can say on the subject. I hope you won't bother me about this matter again, for it won't do you or me any good. Absolutely no more interviews. See my attorney. I must bid you good day now." The man turned and left, a little stiffly it seemed, but with at least an effort at his customary politeness. Then Mrs. Hutchins turned to her niece and said, "Hazel, will you occupy a tent with me tonight? I've got something heavy weighing on my mind, and I simply must take some friendly member of the family into my confidence." Hazel promised to do as Aunt Hannah requested. Chapter 11. A Storm and a Story. After the first clear warning in the southeastern sky, the storm came rapidly, driven by a furious wind. The clouds were dark, almost black, and here and there were streaked or fringed with grayish white. Their advance across the heavens appeared as rapid as that of a train moving across a prairie in the distance. The Campfire Girls, their guardian, and Mrs. Hutchins all remained outside until the first drops of rain fell. In accord with the guardian's suggestion, it was decided not to light a bonfire, lest some of the embers be blown onto the tents. Hazel and Mrs. Hutchins occupied the tent of Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, who had returned to their house near the cultivated portion of the farm. Darkness settled rapidly, and they lighted several candles, which illuminated the sheltered enclosure very well. Then they seated themselves on camp chairs beside one of the cots, and Aunt Hannah introduced the subject that was weighing heavily on her mind, her narrative being punctuated with flashes of lightning and peals of thunder, while the rain poured down in torrents on the fly of the tent. "You will remember this evening as perhaps you will remember none other in your entire girlhood," she began, "and there is a peculiar reason for my prophecy. If I had been planning every detail ahead, I would not have selected a stormy night in a semi-wilderness as time and place for telling my story. There is more in the psychology of a storm than most people suspect. I know this from a very impressionable experience. Many of the things heard, seen, and done by me in my childhood days I cannot recall now without some of the awe associations of a stormy night in the country. Therefore, I would suggest that you attempt to fix your mind calmly on the unromantic reality of things in order that you may recall this scene in after years as rationally as possible." "I surely must look for something unusual and interesting after an introduction of that kind," Hazel interposed. "I suppose I am too young to get the full meaning of what you say, and yet I can't help looking for something very much out of the ordinary." "Your expectation is well warranted," Aunt Hannah replied, "and I'll leave it for you to decide as to whether I have overdone the thing in my introductory warning. Well, here goes. The trouble I'm in has a double cause. I have lost something and I have forgotten something. If I could remember what I have forgotten, the loss probably would not be serious. If I had what I lost, the lapse of memory probably would be of no consequence." "That doesn't sound as if you overdid your warning," Hazel said with a smile as she leaned forward in an attitude of deepened interest. "I'll go back to the beginning of my story," Mrs. Hutchins continued. "Your Uncle Edmund, who died 18 months ago, was trustee of an estate amounting to more than $100,000, and to secure his bondsman, scheduled nearly all of his property, including this farm. The chief beneficiary of the estate is a child, a grandnephew of his, who is in the custody of another relative in Baltimore. Well, at the death of my husband, the trusteeship passed to me. But before his death, there was a period of several months during which it was evident that something was weighing heavily on his mind and troubling him greatly. I tried to find out what it was, but was unsuccessful for some time. At last I learned that there was a minor heir and legatee of the estate who was trying to make trouble, and he was succeeding in annoying your uncle far more than I had any idea. In fact, although I did not realize it at the time, your uncle's mental balance was wavering. The estate consisted principally of mortgage bonds, only a few of which were registered. Your uncle kept them at first in a vault in Baltimore, but a few months before he died, he brought them to Fairbury and put them in a local vault. I did not know this, or I would have suspected something wrong, for the small vaults here are hardly the best places for keeping a fortune of that size and character. On his deathbed he informed me of this act, and also that he had moved the securities from the local vault. He told me where he put them, but I was in such a state of distress that it made no impression on my mind. It seems to me that he said he buried the papers, but for the life of me I can't recall where it was. I did remember, however, that he said he had left a sealed letter addressed to me at one of the local banks, with instruction for its delivery to me in the event of his death. The letter, he said, contained full information as to where I would find the papers of this trust estate, and I suppose the fact that I knew he had left such information caused me to pay little attention to his oral statement as to where the papers were. A day or two after his death, the letter was delivered to me, but I was in no condition of mind to pay any attention to business. I opened the letter, saw that it dealt with business pure and simple, and laid it aside, intending to take the matter up when I felt better. But when I looked for it a few days later, I could not find it. For a year and a half I hunted the house high and low for that letter. Meanwhile, relatives of the heir began to ask questions as the usual remittances failed to come. I was in a quandary, and I suppose foolishly evaded the issue, hoping to find the letter that would tell me where the missing papers were. They became more insistent, and I began to make remittances from my own resources. But their suspicions were aroused, and a demand was made upon me for an accounting. Realizing that the bond given by my husband and myself was ample security, I refused. But it seems that some of my husband's relatives did not like me very well and were bent on making trouble for me. They hired a lawyer, a Mr. Anderson, a man you saw here a little while ago, and the systematic course of hypocritically polite annoyance that he began indicated the kind of instructions he had received from his clients. That was the nature of his mission here today. He threatened to start proceedings against me in the local courts if I did not voluntarily give up my trusteeship and turn over the property in my charge to another trustee whom his clients wished to be named. I refused. "Hadn't you ever seen this lawyer before he called today?" Hazel asked. "No, I hadn't," Aunt Hannah replied. His annoyances had been conducted through the mails and through a local attorney, the most unscrupulous member of the bar in Fairbury. "Haven't you a lawyer of your own who advises you in this matter?" "To be sure I have, and he knows the whole situation. I've directed this man, Anderson, and his local representative to communicate with him, but they refused to do it. I've been turning Anderson's letters over to my lawyer, and now he has come to see me personally." "Didn't you ever find that missing letter?" Hazel inquired. "Oh, yes, I did," Aunt Hannah said apologetically, as if suddenly recovering from a lapse of memory. "And where do you think I found it? The simplest place on earth. It had slipped down behind the facing of the mantel over the fireplace. I found it on the 4th of July, shortly before we left the house to go to the square where the celebration was held. I was looking for a little gold pin that I had missed, and got up on a chair to get a better view over the mantel. Then for the first time I observed that the mantel was sprung out slightly from the fireplace. Like a flash, the suggestion came to me that that was where the missing letter might be, and I looked eagerly down into the crevice. Sure enough, a white paper edge was in plain view. I got a hat pin and began to pick at it. Presently I drew out the missing letter written by my husband. I opened it, but quickly discovered something that my first glance months ago had failed to impress on my mind. The handwriting of my husband, particularly in the latter part of the letter, was so nervous and pot-hooked as to be almost illegible. It was but another indication of his mental condition during the last few months before he died. I saw at once that it would require considerable study to decipher it, so I put it into my handbag, hoping to find an opportunity to study it over in the course of the day, or possibly to see my lawyer and enlist his aid. "And that letter was the article stolen from your handbag which caused you such distress," Hazel exclaimed, unable longer to repress her excited suspicion. "Exactly," Aunt Hannah replied, "and with it went my husband's secret, which he told to me and which I forgot." . 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12. 12 A sequel to the secret. But there is a sequel to this secret, Aunt Hannah continued after a few moments' pause. I haven't told you who the minor legatee was that tried so hard to make trouble for your uncle over the estate. His name was Percy Tyche, a son of my husband's half-brother, Orland Tyche. Percy was about 25 years old and a circus man by profession. I never liked him or his father, although I had seen them only a few times. Orland died before your Uncle Edmund. Percy visited at our house half a dozen times during the last 10 or 12 years, but he always came uninvited and remained only a short while. But that isn't the sequel I referred to. It is something more interesting. When those two scoundrels began their pretended fight on the public square yesterday to get the people worked up to such a pitch of excitement that the pickpockets might find a field of easy victims, I thought there was something familiar in the face and form of the smaller man. I watched him closely to determine if my suspicions were true or not. The longer I watched, the more confident I became that I was not mistaken. My suspicion was strongly reinforced as the evidence of his athletic skill increased. I looked carefully for a good view of his features. Then when he sprang up on the shoulders of the larger man and balanced himself there for half a minute, I needed no further evidence. Nobody but an acrobat could have performed such a feat, and moreover, while he stood balanced on the shoulders of his supposed adversary, I got an excellent view of his countenance. There was no doubt of it. He was my late husband's nephew, Percy Tyche. Why, he must be a professional crook, said Hazel, shocked at the idea of such a person's being a relative of hers. Of course he is, Aunt Hannah replied. And you don't know what humiliation I felt at the disgrace it must heap upon me if the fact should become known that a near relative of my husband's was one of the leaders in that awful affair. What I can't understand, Hazel continued, is why a man of his ability and skill should throw away his opportunities for an honorable success and devote his time and energies to such an unprincipled occupation. Ah, returned Aunt Hannah slowly and with a significant accent. Right there is where you have much to learn about life. Women, as a rule, don't learn much of this phase of human affairs, or if they do, the knowledge they acquire is so contrary to their feminine ideals that the result is usually bewilderment and intolerant confusion. But the new woman is not going to be so easily confused. Schooled in a new civic education of which the Campfire Girls organization is a worthy exponent, she will have so much strength and system of character and intelligence in her makeup that, well, it will be a cold day when she will be guilty of marrying a penniless title or quitting high school to go on the stage. I'm not sure that I see the connection, Auntie, Hazel said. The connection is entirely abstract, Mrs. Hutchins answered. I mean to say that the girl with a good common-sense education gathers much more rapidly an understanding and appreciation of the ways of the world than the girl who is satisfied with a butterfly existence. In other words, to get back to our subject, do you mean that a girl of ordinarily good intelligence ought to understand why it is possible for men of strong and even brilliant intellects to be thoroughly dishonest? Hazel inquired. I wouldn't say that she ought to understand why such a thing is possible, Aunt Hannah replied. But she ought to know that it is true, and also that it is possible for women to make the same big mistakes in life that many men make. If I had taken this thing as seriously before your Uncle Edmund died, I would first of all have had more interest in my husband's business affairs, before his mind began to weaken. Moreover, I might even have been able to supply for him a business companionship that would have prevented him from slipping into a mental collapse. And if I had been more alert to the dangers that are ambushed about important duties postponed, I would have forgotten all about the 4th of July and the celebration until that letter was deciphered. Now I am afraid it has fallen into the hands of the very person who would make use of it to my hurt more quickly than anyone else. He may already have those securities in his possession." "You mean Percy Tyche?" "I do." "But how could he have gotten hold of the letter?" "You forget, Hazel, that he was one of the band of bad men who evidently worked together in a thoroughly organized manner. Undoubtedly they compared notes afterward, and if the scoundrel who stole my handbag kept the letter that he took out of it, he may quite possibly have produced that letter at the meeting where they exchanged mutual congratulations over their success." "But why should they want to keep such a thing as a letter?" Hazel inquired. "Now you are exhibiting some real ignorance of the ways of the world," said Aunt Hannah with a smile. "Don't you see that it is very likely that a professional crook, who makes a study of his business the way those men evidently did, would like nothing better than to get possession of the private correspondence of a wealthy woman, which might contain tips of how to get his hands onto some of her money?" "You surely are a wise woman," Hazel remarked admiringly. "Really, Auntie, I don't believe you are to be blamed for this misfortune. It is just plain bad luck, which can overtake anybody." "Now, Hazel," protested Mrs. Hutchins severely, "just on account of that remark of yours, I'm going to give you a lecture. Get ready, for it's going to be right straight from the shoulder." Chapter 13. Hazel Asks a Question. "I shall be glad to listen to a lecture from my wise Aunt Hannah," was the reply with which Hazel greeted her relative's announcement. "It seems to me that you have given me one pretty good lecture already this evening. What is the next one about?" "It is about luck," was the other's reply. "You introduced the subject in such a serious manner that it seems you must believe in luck. How about it, Hazel? Do you really?" The girl smiled and hesitated. She did not know just how to reply. She saw at once that no matter which way she answered the question, Aunt Hannah was certain to demand a reason. To her, this thing called luck had always been foolish, whether one believed in it or not. If one believed in it, he should admit it, laugh, and forget it. If he did not believe in luck, he should say so, laugh, and forget it. "Why, yes, I suppose I believe in luck," she said. "I don't see how you can get away from it. You know, some people are born in the best of home surroundings, while others are born in hovels. Isn't that luck?" "Not in the least," Aunt Hannah replied. "I don't want to try to force you to believe something you can't see, but I want to say this. There is a reason for everything. You must assume this as invariably true if you would live the most satisfactory life. Often we can't see the reasons of things, but in so far as we are able to observe and analyze, reason is at the very foundation of human existence. The idea of fortune is directly opposed to reason. There is no such thing as chance or accident. You slip and fall, perhaps sprain your ankle. You call it an accident. No such thing. There was a little ice on the sidewalk. You didn't notice it. If you had seen it, probably you would have avoided it or properly measured your step on it. Many people would term my experience yesterday a great misfortune. It wasn't. Because it hit me so hard, so unexpectedly, you yourself are disposed to look at it in this light. The trouble was, I didn't use my head as vigorously as I should have used it. In the first place, it was foolish for me to carry that paper with me in my handbag. That was really silly. Think of it. If I had carried $100,000 worth of jewels around in my handbag for several hours in a big crowd, you would have called me insane. And yet I carried around with me a paper that told the secret of the whereabouts of that much wealth. And if it had been $100,000 worth of jewels, that had been stolen from my handbag, few persons would think of me as an unfortunate victim deserving of universal sympathy. People might say, "Too bad," but they would also shake their heads as though they thought I must be in my second childhood. Hazel's eyes were now sparkling with interest in spite of the deep concern she felt at her aunt's predicament. "Why, Aunt Hannah," she exclaimed, "I never heard anybody talk like that before. I can see readily enough that what you say is true, but I am all confusion. I can't understand why we should look so differently at two things which really amount to one and the same thing." "The reason is this," the lecturer replied. "We look through magnifying glasses at the ideas that dazzle our minds. There is very little to dazzle the mind's eye in a scrap of paper telling where a $100,000 mortgage bond is hidden. It is very interesting, but you could carry it around sewed up in the lining of your coat for a month with perfect propriety. But carry around the $100,000 mortgage bond in precisely the same place and condition, and the person who finds it out is likely to think of reporting you to the authorities for a mental examination. I don't know, Hazel, if you will understand why I should talk this way to you, but there really are several good reasons. First, since my husband died, there has been nobody to whom I could go with my troubles and my problems and get sympathy. About the only person with whom I have discussed these things is my lawyer, but my talks with him, of course, are of entirely different character from this one. Matters had come almost to a crisis before I found that letter behind the mantel. You don't know how it cheered me. And then to think that I let the whole thing slip through my hands by the most foolish conduct one could be guilty of. It is almost more than I can bear. It will probably mean, Hazel, that I will lose practically everything I have in the world." "No, not that bad," Hazel exclaimed in deep distress. "Didn't you report to the police the fact that you recognized one of those 4th of July crooks? They may find him and recover that letter for you." "Yes, I did," Aunt Hannah replied. "I took the matter up with my lawyer this morning, and we had an interview with the chief of police. It is my one hope, but a very slim one, I am afraid." Hazel was silent for a minute or two. She was thinking hard. The rapid succession of events was racing back and forth in her mind more furiously even than the storm outside. By this time the thrashing of the elements had subsided considerably, and the storm had settled down to a heavy pour, with less lightning and thunder and with a less tortuous drive of wind. Mrs. Hutchins sat quietly with her arms folded and gazing despondently into the opposite corner of the tent. Presently Hazel spoke again, and the result of her utterance was startling, to say the least. She seemed to change the subject entirely, and it may be that this seeming change, together with the apparent irrelevance of her words, contributed much to the weirdness of their effect. "Aunt Hannah," she said, "do you ever walk in your sleep?" Aunt Hannah started forward so suddenly that it seemed as if she would leap out of her chair. Chapter 14. A Story Cut Short. "Why do you ask that question, Hazel?" Mrs. Hutchins inquired after she recovered from the shock which her niece's question had given her. "I don't know exactly," the girl replied. "At least I don't want to answer your question until I get a little more information on the subject from you." "Why not?" "Because you might not see any connection between your walking in your sleep and the matters we have been talking about." "All right, I'll wait. Go ahead." "Do you ever walk in your sleep?" Hazel repeated. "I haven't of recent years," Aunt Hannah replied. "But I used to walk in my sleep a good deal when I was a girl. I am going to tell you a secret regarding that subject, which no doubt will interest you very much. There is no particular reason why it should be a secret, but I am not much of a woman to talk about my personal affairs, and since I probably have not mentioned it for 20 or 30 years, I suppose my friends have all forgotten it. I was born and reared on a farm in Pennsylvania. The house in which we lived was a large, picturesque colonial structure, containing everything from an oil portrait of George Washington to an attic well populated with ghosts. We children, of course, were the creators of that colony of disembodied spirits, but they were very real creatures to our minds. There were 6 of us, 3 girls and 3 boys, and we were all of us possessed with the weird imaginations of childhood. I suppose these notions of ours were peculiar to the time and the neighborhood in which we lived. I was what was known as a flighty child, particularly when I was ill. Just a little fever accompanying some child's illness was enough to send me away on the wings of the most fantastic dreams. Many a time the wild manner in which I would sit up or stand up in bed and utter the most ridiculous ideas in my sleep frightened my parents into apprehensions of serious consequences to me. They and the family physician pronounced me abnormally nervous, but parenthetically, I do not regard myself as especially nervous now. Well, these peculiarities of mine developed to such an extent I had to be watched closely every time a simple little child's illness came upon me. But this grew to be quite a joke with my brothers and sisters. My flighty words and actions in my sleep were about the funniest thing they ever heard or saw. It became so common an affair that they would wait for it with great glee, and next day would twit me about the ridiculous things I did and said in my sleep. For a few years matters continued in this way, and then I seemed to outgrow my flighty tendency or habit or whatever you choose to call it. I suppose a year went by without any further experience of this kind, until one night I awoke and found myself out of bed, standing somewhere with a wall of darkness all about me, except for a patch of faint starlight at a window several yards away. I stood very still for I know not how long, wondering whether I was awake or asleep. As the conviction crept over me stronger and stronger that I was really awake and had been walking in my sleep, I tried harder and harder to convince myself that I was in the land of dreams. But at last I realized that there was no use trying to delude myself, and I began to study my surroundings to determine how I was to find my way back to my bed. I must have spent 15 minutes trying to find out where I was. I am sure it took half of that time to convince me that I was not in my own room. I made my way over to the window, feeling every inch carefully lest I fall down a stairway, and even when I got there I had difficulty in determining in what part of the house I was. But finally I got my bearings, and where do you suppose I found myself? I was in an unfurnished room at the end of the house, farthest from my bedroom, and I could now determine that when I awoke, I was near the door that opened onto the stairway, which led up into what we children had always called the ghost attic. It was now easy for me to make my way back to my room, which I did, and crept back into bed feeling very foolish. I was glad indeed that nobody had seen me. Well, I studied a good deal over that incident, which of course I kept a closed secret, and finally decided that my walking in my sleep on this occasion must have been a result of reading a ghost story the day before, in which some young folks valiantly invaded a haunted house after night, only to find that the supposed ghosts were a colony of bats that infested the place. I couldn't recall dreaming about anything of the kind myself, but sleepwalkers as a rule, I understand, don't remember their dreams. I was 18 years old when this occurred. Nothing further of the kind happened until 14 months later, the middle of the following summer, when I walked clear out of the house in the middle of the night and down to the boys' swimming pool that was fed by the creek that ran through Father's farm. I don't know what it was that caused me to make this trip, unless it was the talk I had heard among the boys about the springboard they had set up on the bank for diving. I was not ill on this occasion, nor on the last preceding. But fortunately I was watched, or I probably would not be here tonight, for I was unable to swim. A young man who was earning his way through college by working on farms in the summer and anything he could get to do out of school hours, was employed by my father during this summer. He had been out late that night and was coming into the yard as I left the house. He followed me. I went direct to the swimming hole and walked out on the springboard. The young man who was following me rushed forward to stop me, but too late. I got to the end of the board when, crack, the board broke. Mrs. Hutchins got no further. Her story was interrupted in a manner that took the minds of both narrator and listener off the subject. The violence of the storm had subsided, so that although there was still a heavy downpour of rain, it was accompanied by little noise resulting from confusion of the elements. Almost simultaneously with the utterance of the word crack by Aunt Hannah, indicating the sound of the breaking of a swimming pool springboard hundreds of miles distant and more than 30 years before, came the sound of a real crack that split the air sharply 200 yards away. It sounded very much like the explosion of a firearm, and before a word of astonishment could escape the lips of the startled listeners, the sound was followed by another and another of like character in rapid succession. Then came the scream of a human voice indicative of mingled pain, anger, and terror. Chapter 15. Hazel Figures It Out. For fully a minute after the last sound of the gun battle a short distance from the camp of the Campfire Girls died away, Hazel Edwards and her aunt sat gazing at each other with fear-blanched countenances. Not that they were in great dread of the infliction of any personal harm upon them, for there was probably only a remote possibility of anything of that sort. But circumstances of this character usually compel in witnesses a vague kind of awe and strike an inharmonious gamut of chills that wither the human soul even where the likelihood of physical injury is remote. The sounds of the disturbance had one very effective result in the tent occupied by Hazel and Mrs. Hutchins. It drove from their minds all thoughts of the conversation in which they were engaged. Aunt Hannah's story remained unfinished at the critical point of where it was interrupted, and the only evidence furnished to her audience of one that she was not drowned immediately after the breaking of the springboard was the fact that she was there to tell the story. "My, wasn't that terrible?" Hazel exclaimed at last, as if she had just been able to catch her breath. "It's as mysterious as it was terrible," Aunt Hannah replied. "I can't imagine what could be the occasion of such an affair. That yell was simply blood-curdling." "I believe I can make a pretty good guess as to what it means," Hazel said, brightening up a little. "Probably a couple of tramps sought shelter from the storm in that old log building and got into a fight." "There's just one objection I have to that theory," Mrs. Hutchins replied. "Tramps, as a rule, don't carry automatic pistols." "How do you know those were automatics?" asked Hazel, not a little astonished at her aunt's shrewdness. "Because of the rapidity with which they were discharged. I'm something of a firearm expert, Hazel, since my husband died and I've had so much property to protect, with only servants as companions." They lapsed into quiet for a few moments and listened intently for further sounds indicating the results of the battle, but none came. The only sounds they heard were those produced by the falling rain and the conversation among the girls in the other tents, undoubtedly concerning the wild and mysterious disturbance in the vicinity of the abandoned rustic hotel. "If it weren't for the danger of revealing our presence to the persons who took part in that duel, I'd call out to the other girls and ask if everything were all right with them," Mrs. Hutchins remarked presently. "Oh, Auntie!" exclaimed Hazel, as an interesting idea came to her suddenly. "I believe I have the real explanation of that shooting affair. I bet anything it was a fight among some of those 4th of July pickpockets who couldn't agree over the division of their loot." "Why, Hazel," returned her aunt eagerly, I really believe you've struck the truth." Hazel was delighted at the hearty acceptance of her theory. In her eagerness, she was impelled to supplement her surmise with something more that was equally interesting. "And maybe," she said, "one of those men over there has in his possession that valuable letter that you lost. Don't you think we ought to get out of here as soon as this heavy rain slacks up a little, return to your house and telephone to the police? We ought to get some officers down here before daylight. Those men are probably staying in that old building during the night and will undoubtedly leave in the morning." "That's a good idea," Mrs. Hutchins replied. "I tell you what we'll do meanwhile. We'll sleep in shifts until it stops raining. You lie down and sleep for an hour or two, and I'll keep watch for a slackening of the storm. If it doesn't slow up by, say, 10:30 o'clock, I'll call you and then lie down for a while myself." "No, Auntie," Hazel objected. "I'll take the first watch. I'm not the least bit sleepy. I have some magazines here that I'd like to read anyway." Aunt Hannah was really tired as a result of her exertions during the day, and it was not hard to induce her to yield to this modification of her plan. As she lay down on one of the cots, Hazel remarked, "I wish I could talk with the girls in the other tents. They must have been alarmed at those terrible sounds. If we could all get together and reassure each other that we are all right, no doubt everybody in this camp would rest better until morning." "We'll visit them all before we go back to the house to telephone to the police," Mrs. Hutchins replied. "I have an idea for improving the efficiency and convenience of our camp," Hazel said as she turned the leaves of a periodical she had just picked up. "Do you know what made me think of it? It's a telephone advertisement in this magazine. Why shouldn't we install a telephone system in our camp? I don't believe it would cost much, and we could have lots of fun with it. Besides, what a convenience it would be right now. Why didn't we ever think of it before?" "Necessity is the mother of invention, you know," Aunt Hannah reminded with a smile. "Yes, and sleep is a necessity of rest. Now, Auntie, you go right to sleep and forget about telephones and everything else. I'll wake you when I get sleepy or when it stops raining." Chapter 16. 3 Messengers. Hazel did not wake her aunt because of any sleepy desire to be relieved of her watch. About 10 o'clock she observed that the downpour of rain was not nearly so heavy as it had been an hour or two earlier, so she decided not to awaken the sleeping woman as long as it seemed probable that the rainfall would stop in a short time. 15 minutes later she was able to hear no patter of water drops on the fly of the tent, and she was about to go outside to inspect the condition of the weather when the flaps of the entrance were pushed apart and Harriet Newcomb and Violet Munday entered. "Oh, I'm so glad you came," Hazel said softly. "Shh, don't wake Aunt Hannah. She's pretty tired and has had a lot to worry her. Sit down on this cot over here and I'll tell you what has happened, and then you can go and inform the other girls." Hazel told her story in as few words as possible, closing with her suggestion that she and Aunt Hannah return to the latter's house and telephone for police assistance. "But I'm wondering now if that is the best plan after all," she added. "Aunt Hannah is pretty well along in years, you know, and I'm afraid the trip afoot wouldn't do her any good. It's less than a mile, but it is so dark and the ground is so wet that I'm afraid she couldn't safely walk that distance under those circumstances after the other exertion and trouble she has gone through. Now, if one of you girls would go with me, we'd make the trip in no time." "I'll go," volunteered Harriet and Violet in almost the same breath. Then Harriet added, "We can both go with you. That'll be good company. 3's a crowd, you know, and we'll need a crowd to chase the midnight gloom out of the wet woods." "All right, girls, that will be fine," Hazel said gratefully. "Thank you ever so much. Now will you go with me around to the other tents to inform the girls that everybody is all right? Don't say anything to them about our going to the house because that will delay matters too much. You two have a tent together, haven't you? All right, you won't have to do much explaining to anybody. We'll each take a tent and soon have it all over with." The three girls worked rapidly, and in 15 minutes they were back in the tent occupied by Hazel and Mrs. Hutchins. The latter was still asleep. Hazel woke her gently and informed her what she and Harriet and Violet proposed to do. Aunt Hannah did not protest, for she realized that this plan was the best. She thanked the girls heartily and then gave them instructions as to how to get into the house and whom they should call up when they got in. "I was thinking the matter over as I fell asleep and recalled our conversation, Hazel, about asking aid from the police," Mrs. Hutchins said. "We were wrong in one respect. The police have no authority outside the city limits. The county sheriff is the man you want to call. His name is Caleb Stevens. You'll find him in the telephone book as sheriff, or if by any chance you can't find the book, call the operator and she'll get the sheriff's home on the wire for you." "You're not afraid to stay here in this tent alone, are you?" Hazel asked as they prepared to leave. For answer, Mrs. Hutchins picked up a small valise in which she had brought a few personal effects to the camp, opened it, and took out a small black, stocky L-shaped automatic pistol and slipped it under the pillow of her bed, saying, "Anybody who gets the best of me will have to get his hands on me before I can get my hands on this." These words sent a rather gruesome chill through the girls, and Hazel hastened to change the subject. "It's too bad," she said, "that there isn't an extra cot in one of the other tents. But we won't be gone long, Auntie. We ought to be back in an hour easily." "Don't lose your way," Aunt Hannah warned. "No danger of that," Hazel replied. "We've been over that route several times and we've got some good flashlights to light our path. We'll leave one for you, Auntie. It may come handy and you won't need to keep the candles burning. Here's one." Hazel took an electric flashlight from under her pillow and gave it to her aunt, who had lain down again on her cot. Then she took another from a satchel in which she kept a supply of personal miscellany and announced that she was ready to start. "Well, bye-bye, Auntie," Hazel said, pausing a moment at the entrance before following the other two girls who had stepped outside. "You'd better go to sleep again and get all the rest you can. There's no telling when we'll be back. We may have to wait for the sheriff unless we can give him all the information he wants over the telephone." Hazel turned to go, then stopped with this addition to her goodbye remarks. "By the way, perhaps we had better announce ourselves and not appear before you too suddenly on our return. If you should be awake, you'll know we've got back when you hear us call out, 'Whoa, hello.'" In a few moments, the three girls were making their way, Indian file, up the hill toward the trail that led across country to Aunt Hannah's house. Chapter 17. Calling Help. The trip to Mrs. Hutchins' home was quickly made. The difficulties on the way were of only minor character. The girls were well equipped for obstacles and inconveniences. To protect them against the water-laden trees, bushes, grass, and further rainfall, they wore raincoats and rain hats and waterproof hiking shoes. Their electric flashlights also were very serviceable in aiding them to pick their way. The trail they followed was a well-worn cowpath over the big hill and through the forest as far as the barnyard. Beyond this, the three messengers followed the path through the orchard, which recalled to the minds of Hazel and Harriet another journey of equally thrilling character on the night before. But they said nothing about it, inasmuch as Aunt Hannah's somnambulism was a secret between them. They proceeded at once to the front entrance, where Hazel pushed the electric button. In a few moments a voice, which they easily recognized as Minerva's, called through the door. "Who's there?" "It's Hazel and two of the other girls, Minerva," the former answered. "Let us in. We want to telephone." The colored housekeeper unlocked and opened the door with such haste as to startle the midnight callers, or at least to arouse no little curiosity in them. but the reason for Minerva's precipitate haste was soon explained. "Land o' livin', child!" the faithful negress exclaimed with deep emotion as she swung the door wide open. "You don't mean to tell me Mrs. Hutchins is sick and you's goin' telephonin' for a doctor?" "Oh, no, nothing of that sort," Hazel replied reassuringly. "We left her perfectly well in the camp, but there's been some bad men fighting with guns down at the old hotel, and we want to call the sheriff for protection." "My land o' goodness!" cried Minerva. "Are you sure they ain't killed all the rest of you Campfire Girls by this time?" "We hope not, Minerva," Hazel said with a smile that ought to have dispelled the fears of her inquisitor. Without further ado, she went to the telephone desk and after a hurried search in the directory, rang the operator and gave her a number. 5 minutes later, Sheriff Stevens, roused out of a sound slumber, called gruffly into her ear. "Hello?" "Hello," Hazel replied. "Is this the sheriff?" "Yes," was the answer, more sharp and short than gruff this time. "What do you want?" "This is Mrs. Hutchins' niece, Miss Edwards," Hazel began to explain when she was interrupted. "Oh, Miss Edwards," said the voice at the other end of the wire, although it sounded like that of another person. "Excuse my abruptness, but I guess I haven't waked up yet. What can I do for you?" "We Campfire Girls are camping down in Fern Hollow," Hazel recited rapidly, for she had rehearsed her story to herself several times, in order that she might be able to make as speedy and effective an appeal to the sheriff as possible. "Aunt Hannah is with us. 3 of us just came back through the wet timber to Mrs. Hutchins' house to call you up. There's been a fight with firearms between some men down at that old log hotel in the hollow. We could hear the shots in rapid succession, and then there was an awful scream and we didn't hear anything more. Can you come right away? Aunt Hannah thinks the men who had the fight must belong to that gang of thieves that raided Fairbury on the 4th. One of them stole a very valuable paper from her handbag, and she's very anxious to get it back." "I'll get busy right away, Miss Edwards," the sheriff replied with businesslike energy, which indicated that he regarded the source of this summons as an extremely important one. "Where is your camp?" "Just a short distance south of the old hotel." "Are you going back?" "Yes, right away, unless there's something to keep us here. We want to go back and tell Aunt Hannah you're coming." "Tell her I'll be there in an hour if possible, or as soon as I can get my men together. If there are men down there desperate enough to use guns, we'll have to come in good force and well prepared." "All right. Goodbye." Hazel hung up the receiver and announced results to her companions. Minerva and another servant, who had arrived on the scene in time to hear the principal part of the statement to the sheriff, stood by with odd expressions on their faces. "I think I'll call up Mr. Mackenzie and tell him what has happened," Hazel said as the thought came to her. "What is his number, Minerva?" 142, the latter replied, and a few moments later this number was being rung. Mr. Mackenzie did not require as much time to wake up as did Sheriff Stevens. In about 2 minutes he was answering the call quite cheerfully. After listening to Hazel's story, he said, "I'll be with you in a jiffy. Just wait there at the house and I'll call and go back with you." 15 minutes later, Mr. Mackenzie, with a magazine shotgun on his shoulder, rang the front doorbell, and the 3 girls left the house and followed him along the path through the orchard and to the pitch-dark timber, over the big hill and down into the semi-wilderness of Fern Hollow, which was ringing with the merciless laughter of a swollen, stone-stepped, boulder-blocked stream. 15 or 20 paces from the nearest tent, Hazel softly sounded the agreed signal of approach. "Whoa-he-lo!" And Aunt Hannah answered back like a real Campfire Girl. "Whoa-he-lo!" Chapter 18. Campfire Girl Scouts. "Well, here we are, Aunt Hannah," Hazel announced as she entered the tent. "We've brought help and more is coming. Mr. Mackenzie is here." "Good," Mrs. Hutchins said. "That was very thoughtful of you. It never occurred to me to suggest that you call him up. I couldn't think of anyone except the police. Did you have any trouble making the trip?" "Not in the least. We found our way almost as easily as if it had been daylight. We knocked oceans of water off the bushes and small trees, and we just waded in water where the grass was high, but I didn't even get my feet wet," said Violet with a figurative extravagance. "Really, I think it was a delightful adventure, especially so if we prove we have started a campaign that will result in capturing some of those bad men who stole our money and valuables." Mr. Mackenzie did not wait for the arrival of the sheriff before beginning an investigation of the strange gun battle in or near the abandoned summer resort hotel. At his request, Hazel loaned him a flashlight, and he started off at once, gun in hand, through the trees and bushes toward the place from which the sounds of battle seemed to have come. Scarcely had he departed when Hazel proved her daring and adventurous spirit by suggesting to Harriet and Violet, "Say, girls, let's follow Mr. Mackenzie and see what he finds. We can keep at a safe distance and not get into trouble where we can be of no service. But there might be developments where we could lend him considerable assistance." "I'm game," Violet announced. "These are not times for girls to be cowards when millions of men are rushing into the volcanoes of the European battlefields impelled by patriotic motives." "Good for you, Violet," Harriet exclaimed enthusiastically. "They won't dare call us the weaker sex much longer, will they, Mrs. Hutchins?" "I should say they won't," the latter replied. "At least not if the girls all join the Campfire organization, and it does for all of them what it has done for you." "We might earn some honors out of this night's work," Violet suggested. "Let's go at it with that in view. What do you say, girls?" "I vote aye," Hazel said. "I too," Harriet chimed in. "Be careful of every move you make," Aunt Hannah warned. "Remember that caution, circumspection, and judgment are just as much necessary qualifications of good Campfire Girls as bravery and daring." "We'll be careful," Hazel promised as the three filed out of the tent. The clouds in the wind-swept heavens were now fast breaking up, indicating that the last remaining forces of the storm were making a hurried retreat in disorder. From the time when the three campfire messengers left their camp to summon aid and protection against the night-hidden men of violence and mystery until their return, there were fitful but unsuccessful efforts on the part of the elements to resume the bombardment of this local section of Mother Earth. Now and then the rain poured down for periods of a minute or two, as if reinforced with an abundant supply of fresh gush and bravado, but the gush soon gave out, and the bravado collapsed into a confession of exhaustion. The storm was really over, and the moon, placid in her far distant removal from this anarchistic thrashing of elements, hovered calmly over the scene, waiting for an opportunity to smile her inconsequential commiseration through the rifts in the clouds. No sooner did she begin this confusing performance that the panic among the broken and exhausted forces of the storm army became general, and the sky was rapidly cleared of the frowning hordes of the enemies of peacefulness. Mr. Mackenzie was out of sight of the camp when the trio of Campfire Girl Scouts left Mrs. Hutchins' tent to reconnoiter. A nondescript miscellany of trees, bushes, shrubbery, and ferns separated this starting place from the abandoned semi-wilderness hotel. Although the moon had difficulty in making her luminous disk clearly visible through the scurrying clouds, still the heavens and all open places upon the earth were comparatively light. This condition was gratefully observed by the young feminine scouts, for they regarded it as unwise to use their searchlights to aid them in finding their way during this reconnoitering excursion. But in spite of the partial clearing of the atmosphere, they found it hard work to pick a passage through the confusion of vegetation. Hence their movements were slow, and it was fully 10 minutes before the dark mass of the abandoned hotel loomed before their eyes. Still, they beheld nothing of special interest other than the awe and the gloom of the scene. There was no sign of life near the building, so far as they were able to see or hear. The storm had driven the night birds and insects into shelter, and few of them had ventured out again following the calming of the elements. "Let's go around the building at a safe distance and see what we can discover," Hazel proposed. The other girls voiced a whispered assent, and they began their encircling advance to the right. About halfway around and directly in front of the entrance of the log structure they stopped, as all of them simultaneously observed the form of a human being, apparently bending over something on the ground. Eagerly, almost fearfully, they leaned forward, as if such inclining of their bodies would enable them to obtain a clearer view of the object of their attention. Chapter 19. The Rescue. Suddenly there was a flash of light, like the striking of a match close to the overleaning human form, but it did not burn out. "That's Mr. Mackenzie," Hazel declared. "See, that's the flashlight we gave him, and he's found something." "Yes, and here's an automobile," Violet announced, pointing around the edge of a large bush near which they were standing. The others looked in the direction indicated and beheld the forward end of a machine protruding about a foot beyond the foliage of the bush. Suddenly Hazel laid a hand on each of her companions and pressed them back, explaining in a soft whisper, "Keep under cover. It may belong to the pickpocket bandits. Wait here a minute and I'll find out." She turned and moved around the bush the other way. A minute later she returned with this announcement. "There's nobody in it, and I don't see anybody around. I don't believe it belongs to the bandits." "Why not?" Violet inquired. "Because it would be foolish for them to stay so near the scene of their raid with a strange automobile. There must be some other explanation to this affair." "What shall we do now?" Harriet asked. "I'm going to signal to Mr. Mackenzie," Hazel replied. "I'm going to test his quickness of wit at the same time and see if he will recognize our call when it's given out in the woods, where it might be mistaken for the call of some denizen of the wilds. He knows what it is, for he's heard us give it and told me one day that it sounded like a combination of the hoot of an owl and the song of a whippoorwill." "Did he say that?" Violet asked, with a whispered suggestion of a laugh. "He ought to be ashamed of himself." "Oh, he was just joking, of course," Hazel continued. "Now I'm going to give the call just as near what he says it sounds like as I can. Stand as close to this bush as you can so he can't see us. Now here goes. Whoa-he-lo." Hazel gave the call with a sort of plaintive hollowness that spoke well for her effort. No uninformed person would have suspected it to have been the utterance of a human voice. Eagerly the girls watched for results. They seemed slow coming. For a few seconds there was not a sign of life in the dimly outlined stooping figure. Presently, however, it stood erect and seemed to turn around. Then came the answer in such a falsetto effort to imitate Hazel's call that each of the girls restrained a laugh only with difficulty. "There's no warning in that call," Hazel said confidently. "Come on, let's go and see what he's found." She turned on her flashlight to enable her to better pick her way, and the other girls did likewise. In a few moments they reached the spot where Mr. Mackenzie stood. There was no need of asking what of interest he had discovered. The girls were shocked with the view of a man lying apparently unconscious on the ground. "Is he dead?" Violet gasped in trembling tones. "No, but he hasn't much life left," Mr. Mackenzie replied. "I mean that he's weak from loss of blood and exposure." "Why, that's Mr. Anderson, the lawyer who came to see Aunt Hannah," Hazel exclaimed as Mr. Mackenzie threw the rays of his flashlight on the injured man's face. "And that must be his automobile over there," Harriet added. "Where is the auto?" the former inquired. "Over by the bush where we were standing when I gave you the wo-hello call," Hazel answered. "Then I'd better put him into his machine and hurry him away to a doctor," said Mr. Mackenzie. "We ought to do something for him here first," Hazel suggested. "What can you do?" "He ought not to have those wet clothes on any longer than absolutely necessary. We can go up to the camp for some blankets to wrap him in." "That isn't a bad idea," Mr. Mackenzie said. "I wonder if two of you girls couldn't take hold of his feet and help me carry him over to the automobile. I'll take him by the shoulders. Then you could go and get the blankets while I got the machine ready to start." Hazel and Harriet took hold of the man's feet as suggested, and Violet lighted the way with her flashlight. It was no easy task, for the wounded man must have weighed at least 170 pounds. But at last they reached the automobile, and with the united effort of all four, aided by the patient, who revived considerably and put forth a fair degree of self-helping energy, they succeeded in getting him into the machine. Then they returned to the camp and got 2 blankets, delaying long enough to inform Mrs. Hutchins of the discovery. The latter was astonished when she learned the identity of the victim. "I thought he drove back toward town when he left us," she said. "But I suppose he thought the storm was too near and decided to seek shelter in that old building. By the way, you'd better take a flask of cordial back with you to brace him up during the drive." The girls went to the kitchen tent and took a flask from the medicine kit, and then hastened back to the patient. Mr. Mackenzie soon had the injured man bundled in a reclining position on the rear seat, and then attempted to reinvigorate him with a dose of the cordial. Thus far he had scarcely uttered a word, but now all were delighted when he spoke thus in a fairly strong voice. "Won't a couple of you girls come along and sit back here in the automobile with me? I'm afraid something might happen. The jolting of the machine might cause me to faint and fall off the seat. Perhaps this good man will bring you back in the machine. You're perfectly welcome to the use of it." "Why, yes, I'll go," Hazel volunteered. "What do you say, Harriet, Violet?" "I'll go," said Harriet. "And I'll go back and stay with your aunt until you return, Hazel," said Violet. This arrangement being favored by all, Hazel and Harriet climbed into the automobile, while Violet turned back toward the camp. The latter gave an agreed signal when she arrived at the tent occupied by Aunt Hannah, and then the auto, with its 2 powerful headlights blazing far in advance, started along the road through the timber toward the main highway. As the injured passenger appeared to have recovered considerable strength and seemed to desire to talk, Hazel encouraged him to tell his story in a few words. The 2 girls were seated on drop seats in front, facing the patient. "I suppose you know who I am," the lawyer began, and as Hazel nodded, he continued. "Well, after I left your camp, the clouds were looking so black and threatening, and the wind was carrying them along so rapidly, that I thought I had not better risk being caught in the storm. So I turned over by that old building, got the machine ready to withstand a driving rain, and got under the roof just as the storm broke. I don't know how long I waited, but it must have been several hours, and I was getting mighty tired and hungry. At last the storm began to abate, and I was beginning to hope that I would soon be able to leave the place when something very unexpected happened. I heard a noise overhead, which plainly meant that some animal larger than a kitten was moving about. I listened intently and presently made up my mind that the sounds could be none other than those of human footsteps. They reached the head of the stairway and then proceeded carefully, cautiously down the steps. I moved back into a dark corner and strained my eyes for as clear a view as possible. Well, the fellow, it was a man, after reaching the first floor, went direct to the fireplace and began to build a fire with wood from a pile of dead timber that somebody had put there. I imagine he must have been asleep upstairs up to the time when the first sounds of his footsteps reached my ears. The fire soon lighted up the room a considerable distance from the fireplace, so that I was certain I would be discovered if the man should turn his eyes toward me. I was not particularly afraid of an encounter with him, for he was a very small man, and moreover, I could see no reason why two such persons as we, who had sought shelter in this out-of-the-way place, should have any occasion for trouble between us. Still, his actions were so peculiar that my bump of curiosity forced me to decide to watch him and see what he was up to. There seemed to be no good reason for building the fire, for while it produced a cheerful light in that gloomy place, it soon made the room uncomfortably warm. But I was not long in finding out what he was up to. He cleared away a place on the hearth, and then began to produce from various pockets such an assortment of pocketbooks, jewelry, and loose change as to leave no doubt in my mind concerning the nature of his profession. Evidently he had made a haul somewhere. Then I recalled the circumstances of the raid of pickpocket bandits in Fairbury on the 4th, and decided at once that he must have been a member of that gang. After he had made a thorough examination of his stolen treasure, he transferred the paper money into a bill book, the loose change into one of his pockets, and threw the purses from which he had taken this money into the fire. Then he took from a pocket of his coat what appeared to be a letter, drew from the envelope a bit of folded paper, unfolded it, held it close to the fire, and began to study its contents. At this point in the narrative, Hazel could scarcely restrain an expression of excitement. She was certain as to the identity of that letter. "He studied and studied over it," the narrator continued, "but seemed to be unable to get anything satisfactory out of it. Meanwhile, I grew very tired standing in an uncomfortable position, and shifted my feet to relieve myself. In doing so, I made a slight noise that caused the fellow to spring up in alarm. I don't know what caused me to make the move that I next made, unless it was the consciousness that he was a criminal and must be desperately alarmed at my discovery of so much stolen goods in his possession. I did not have much time to think. It seemed that I must get him first or he might get me, so I made a dive for him, figuring on knocking him out before he could draw a gun. But he was quick as a cat. He dodged the pass I made at him, and I nearly fell over. The next thing I knew, he was plugging away at me with an automatic. He fired 2 shots at me inside the building, but missed both times. I ran out through the doorway and into the rain, which was still coming down pretty heavy. But he rushed out after me and continued to pump his murderous machine gun at me. I think he fired about 4 or 5 shots in the open. One of them struck me in the hip, I believe, and the pain it sent through my frame was just plain agony. I recall uttering a scream with all my lungs, not so much because of the pain as with a hope of sounding an alarm that might result in his capture. When I fell, my head must have struck a stone or something hard that knocked me out. "We heard the shots and the scream, and they were the cause of our coming to your assistance," Hazel explained. "I want to thank you very much for what you have done for me," the injured man returned. "If there is any way in which I can return the favor, I am sure you won't make a mistake by letting me know." "There is a way you can do me a great favor," Hazel said quickly but calmly. "Tell me how, and it is as good as done," the lawyer promised, rashly perhaps. "Stop persecuting my Aunt Hannah Hutchins." The wounded man was silent for more than a minute. Chapter 20. Sleeping Too Late. "What makes you think I have been persecuting your aunt?" Attorney Anderson at last inquired. "Because she says you have," Hazel replied unhesitatingly. "She says you represent some of her late husband's relatives who have no use for her and just delight in making trouble for her." The injured man was silent again for a few moments. He seemed to be suffering considerably, as a result perhaps of the jolting of the machine over a rough and slippery roadway, and of mental exertion in the telling of his story. "You'd better not talk any more now," Hazel said, feeling that quite as good results would be attained by dropping the subject now that she had impressed upon her aunt's persecutor the full force of her request. Would you like a little more of this cordial? We'll be at the hospital pretty soon now." "Yes, I believe I will take another taste," the man replied, reaching for the flask. "But let me reassure you on this point. I'll look into your aunt's affairs from her point of view, as well as from the point of view of my client hereafter, and if I find I have done her an injustice, it will stop so far as I am concerned, at least." "She could ask nothing more than that from you," Hazel said with a little sigh of relief. The patient was taken to the only hospital in the city and left in charge of a nurse. Then Mr. Mackenzie drove the machine back to camp and left the two girl passengers there, after which he took the automobile back to the garage where it belonged. It was almost daylight when Hazel and Harriet entered the tent that had been occupied by Harriet and Violet before the beginning of events that had made the night so wakeful a period for them. They were tired and sleepy, and their first thought was to get into bed as soon as possible. Their last topic of conversation before they closed their eyes in slumber was discussed thus: "I wonder if the sheriff got here and if he has succeeded in getting a line on anything," Harriet said. "Yes, I wonder too," was Hazel's answering comment. "But we'll find out in the morning. I want to see him and tell him what Mr. Anderson saw in that old building before the shooting began." "Yes, it might help him to find the whole gang of pickpockets," Harriet suggested. "We ought not to sleep very late, for if he wants any further information, he probably will be here at the camp soon after daybreak." "We probably won't be able to sleep very late with all the noise that comes with the waking up of camp every morning," Hazel reassured. But they did sleep late, and Aunt Hannah was responsible for this fact. She awoke early and warned the other girls not to wake them, as they had been up most of the night. Then followed a long period of explaining, which served chiefly to excite the listeners and delay breakfast. In the meanwhile, Mr. Mackenzie arrived in Mrs. Hutchins' automobile to inquire if all had gone as well as could be expected, and if he could be of any further service. In the course of the conversation, Mrs. Hutchins was reminded of certain matters pertaining to the running of the farm which required her attention, and she decided to return with her farm manager at once. Minerva had sent word that she would delay breakfast until 8:30 o'clock if the missus wished to come back by that time. Hazel and Harriet awoke at about 9 o'clock, and the former expressed surprise and disappointment at the departure of her aunt, for whom she felt she had some very important information. But presently the sheriff appeared at the camp to report that he and 3 other men had been scouring the vicinity for several hours without success. He desired to ask some more questions, he said. His more questions soon brought out the sequel to Hazel's story that she had given to him the night before. Immediately the sheriff started back to town to interview Attorney Anderson at the hospital. During the forenoon, all the girls followed a program which they had mapped out for a period of several days under rules of the Campfire organization. All were working for honors of various sorts. Most of them did beadwork for their ceremonial gowns, basket work, sewing, tatting, embroidering, crocheting, and other such handcraft while resting in camp. While moving about in the timber and over the hillsides and along the banks of the stream, they sought to exercise their skill in nature lore for the purpose of acquiring blue honors. Indeed, they had attained no small degree of skill along such lines, and could name more kinds of trees, grass, flowers, birds, small animals and insects, and even snakes, than many a rash reckoner would ever guess. Early in the afternoon, Hazel became much concerned because she had not yet recited to her aunt the significant details of the story told to her and Harriet by Attorney Anderson of what he saw in the old log hotel the night before. At about 2:30 o'clock she decided that she could not rest until she had seen Mrs. Hutchins and given her this important information. And so she and Harriet walked to Mrs. Hutchins' house to tell their story. But Aunt Hannah was not there. She had gone downtown, Minerva said, and there was no telling when she would be back. They waited until 4:30 o'clock and then decided to return to camp, as there were important arrangements to be made for the council fire that night. Before leaving the house, Hazel requested Minerva to impress upon Aunt Hannah's mind the fact that she had some important information for her, and that she must see her that night or early next morning without fail. "Tell her that if she does not come to the camp tonight, I will be here for breakfast in the morning," were Hazel's departing words. Chapter 21. The Midnight Council Fire. It was 11:30 o'clock at night. The moon was shining brightly from a clear sky. There was a freshness of life in vegetant nature that manifested itself in a degree to every one of the five senses. The heavy rain of the night before and the warm sunshine that followed had got in their good work with evident results everywhere in and about Fern Hollow. At precisely 11:30 o'clock, according to the main timepiece of the Flamingo Campfire Girls' camp, the alarm of said timepiece rang out with far-sounding clearness. The ring was not muffled by the canvas enclosure within which the alarm clock stood, for it was a warm night, and all the tents had been opened to admit all the fresh air that would pass through. With the ringing of the alarm, the two occupants of the tent arose from the cots where they had been reclining and quickly prepared themselves for a tour of the other tents to carry the alarm from the clock to every ear. 5 minutes later, every sleeping tent in the camp was a scene of the liveliest activity. Who says a girl can't dress quickly when occasion demands? The occasion in this instance was a dressing race. As soon as all had been awakened, the signal was given, and then began the novel speed test. Pretty soon the voice of Marie Crismore called out, "Ready! I win!" 2 minutes and 58 seconds, announced Miss Ladd, the timekeeper, who herself made a very good dressing record, although hampered with the necessity of timing of the members of the fire in her charge. The race was a close one, the difference in the time made by the winner and the last girl dressed being measured only by seconds. The picture that now presented itself in the soft moonlight was that of 13 Campfire Girls and their guardian, clad in ceremonial gowns and with tan sheepskin moccasins on their feet, and their hair bound with headbands and strings of honor beads hanging round their necks. Of course, all the girls had reckoned on this race before going to bed, and had plaited their hair in 2 braids each, and were very careful when they lay down not to tangle the loose locks any further than was unavoidable. And so, when they got up, just a dash of their combs over the few tangled places sufficed to make them presentable so far as this portion of their toilet was concerned. The guardian now led the way, uphill a short distance, then directly north 200 yards, taking a zigzag course in order to avoid impediments of bush and underbrush, and then downhill again to a clear and fairly level grassy spot a few rods distant from the abandoned summer resort headquarters. Here all was in readiness for the first midnight council fire any of those present had ever known to be held. Strictly speaking, it was contrary to the spirit of the hygienic rules of the organization, which are not friendly to the keeping of late hours. Miss Ladd objected when the first suggestion of a midnight council fire was made. It was a bad precedent to establish, she said. Young girls should hold fast to the principle of early to bed and early to rise, she argued, but was interrupted by Marie Crismore, who inquired, "Isn't getting up at midnight early rising?" "Yes, but you must go to bed at 4 p.m., the guardian answered quickly. "We'll do that if you say so," said Ernestine Johansson. "But if we go to bed at 8:30 o'clock, take a recess from sleep between 11:30 and 1:30, and then go back to bed and sleep until 6:30, we will have had 8 hours' sleep." "Why have you girls set your hearts on this custom-breaking idea?" Miss Ladd inquired. "The real reason is this," volunteered Violet Monday. "Snoqualm is going to be made a torch-bearer, you know, and Snoqualm is the Indian for moon. Now, when is the best time for her to receive her highest honors as a campfire girl, if it is not when the reign of the moon in the heavens is subject to the least dispute? Midnight. Can we honor Snoqualm any more than by making her a torch-bearer when the sun is directly under her feet? Snoqualm was Hazel Edwards' campfire name. She was not present when this discussion was held, or Violet's speech would have been postponed. The guardian was won over completely by the argument. It was to be a surprise on Hazel. Flamingo Fire, in spite of this departure, was careful in its observance of the rules of the craft. The general instruction that ceremonial meetings should be held weekly at summer camps was obeyed implicitly, and this midnight council fire was the first of 4 scheduled for the month of July. The programs of these meetings promised to be interesting during the entire vacation outing, as the girls were all working industriously for honors and promotion. After their arrival at the scene of this midnight council fire and the formation of the circle, wood and kindling were brought to the center of the circle by the wood gatherers. To Marian Stanlock, a torch-bearer, was assigned the duty of lighting the fire. This she did with the stick-rubbing process, at which she was especially skilled. After the blaze of the burning tinder of shredded cottonwood roots had ignited the kindling and then seized onto the wood that was laid on top, the group of gowned midnight celebrants solemnly recited the following ode. O fire! Long years ago, when our fathers fought with great animals, you were their protection. From the cruel cold of winter you saved them. When they needed food, you changed the flesh of beasts into savory meat for them. During all the ages, your mysterious flame has been a symbol to them for spirit. So tonight we light our fire in remembrance of the Great Spirit who gave you to us. Then followed the chanting of Wohelo Cheer, the roll call of the campfire, most of them Indian names, to which each person responded with the word Kola, the reading of the count, the making of individual reports, the awarding of honors, and finally initiations. There was only one initiation before the council fire, that of Hazel Edwards, Snoqualm, the moon, as torchbearer. At the request of the guardian, she arose, and the ceremony began. The guardian recited the history of her achievements, showing that Snoqualm had the required qualifications of a leader, was trustworthy and unselfish, and that she was able to present 15 honors in addition to those she presented for the rank of firemaker. In conclusion, the head of the fire said, Now, Snoqualm, I call upon you to repeat the torchbearer's desire. And Snoqualm obeyed thus. That light which has been given to me, I desire to pass undimmed to others. Oh, girls, look there! These words, uttered at this juncture in tone and accents of a kind that are not usually associated with the quiet and composure of a council fire, sent a sharp thrill of apprehension through the group of girls and marked the close of the meeting. It was Julietta Hyde who spoke, and with her utterance she pointed one finger off toward the southwest. Every eye turned in the direction indicated and beheld a sight that none of them will ever forget. Just emerging into the open from beyond a clump of bushes and small trees was the form of a woman of a little more than medium height, clad in a loose-fitting garment, head bare, and advancing toward the abandoned summer resort hotel. Chapter 22. Aunt Hannah Wakes Up. Quick, girls! No time for any more ceremony, Hazel exclaimed excitedly. That woman is Aunt Hannah, and she's walking in her sleep. This is the second time she's done this just recently. Harriet and I saw her leave the house night before last and tried to follow her. Something is weighing heavily on her mind, and I must follow her and find out what it is. Come on, Harriet, we'll lead the way. You other girls hold back at a distance and be careful not to wake her. It probably would have a disastrous effect on her nerves. The next instant, after the close of this speech, Hazel and Harriet were darting off through the bushes at considerable danger of stubbing their feet or scratching their faces and hands in their haste not to let the sleepwalker get away from them. Miss Ladd and the other members of the fire followed more circumspectly and with due regard for Hazel's expressed wish. but the two girls ahead found it unavoidable to lose sight of Aunt Hannah for a minute or two. It appeared probable that her place of destination was the abandoned hotel, and if so, she undoubtedly would pass around the south side to get to the main entrance at the east. The two girls realized that it would be impossible for them to follow her along the same course she was taking without there being a short period in the pursuit when the building would be between them and the woman they wished to keep in view. So they accepted the inevitable and made a short cut to the northeast, and soon were in position to observe the sleepwalker as she came around the southeast corner of the building. The latter appeared almost as soon as Hazel and Harriet reached their point of vantage, which was in the shadow of the big cottonwood tree near the building. She made direct for the entrance, looking straight ahead meanwhile, and appearing to be interested in nothing to the right or to the left, nor anything else indeed except the on-leading motive of her dream. "We must follow her inside," said Hazel resolutely. "Are you game, Harriet?" "I am if you are," the other replied, certainly not with bravado, but with a kind of subdued resoluteness. "If we are careful, I don't think she will notice us," Hazel said confidently as she led the way. Into the dark miniature lobby they went and were near enough to the somnambulist to see her pass into the room undoubtedly intended as the guests' lounging place, and containing the fireplace before which the campfire had held one of its meetings. Into this room the two girls followed the woman, and there they found it necessary to get within a few feet of her in order to determine what she was doing. 4 large paneless windows were in the north and south walls, but the illuminating power of the moon's rays was almost entirely shut off by a wide sheltered porch which ran around both of these sides of the building. Hazel and Harriet managed to watch the actions of Mrs. Hutchins at safe proximity by keeping close to the north wall. They felt that they were in little danger of being discovered in this position, as there was only slight possibility of coming into physical contact with the somnambulist, and she seemed to be using her eyes for nothing whatever except to guide her movements straight ahead. Without the least hesitation, Aunt Hannah went to the fireplace, took hold of one of the boulders of which the enclosure of the hearth was constructed, and began to work it from side to side. It required all her strength to do this, but presently she succeeded in lifting the stone out of its place and putting it down on the floor. Then she put her hand into the opening thus made and took out something which the watchers could see so indistinctly that they were unable to form any idea as to what it was. With this in her hands, she walked over to one of the windows, stood there a few moments, then returned, replaced the object in the hole, and put the boulder back where she had found it. This done, she faced about and walked out of the building. "Quick," Hazel whispered to her companion. "Follow Aunt Hannah. I want to see that she gets home safely. I'll be with you in a minute. I must see what she was interested in here." Harriet did as requested, while Hazel pushed the switch of her flashlight and threw the rays upon the spot of greatest interest over the fireplace. The loose boulder was rather large and heavy, and the girl had some difficulty in removing it, but finally she succeeded in depositing it on the floor. Then she reached her hand into the hole as Aunt Hannah had done, and drew out a metal box about 18 inches long and 5 inches square in the cross-section. "I bet $100,000 I know what this box contains," she mused as she turned to follow Harriet and Aunt Hannah. But she had advanced only a few steps when she was seized from behind by a pair of strong hands and thrown violently to the floor. To catch herself, she dropped the box. This was quickly seized by her assailant, who then made a dash for the entrance. But he did not get far. At the door he was seized by other powerful hands, which threw him down upon the porch floor almost as violently as the latter had thrown Hazel. "Come on, Miss Edwards," cried a voice that the panic-stricken but uninjured Hazel recognized as that of Mr. Mackenzie. "I've got him." The girl ran out and snatched up the precious box, which had been dropped again in the scuffle. The former was searching his victim for a weapon. Hazel aided him with the rays of her flashlight. As she observed the features of the man and his small physique, a grave suspicion took possession of her. "Are you Percy Tyche?" she asked, addressing the prisoner, who was no longer struggling. Before he could answer, if he was so disposed, Harriet and Violet appeared on the porch. "Where is Aunt Hannah?" Hazel inquired. "She's outside with the girls," was Harriet's surprising answer. "She woke up. It didn't bother her at all. She's all right." Chapter 23. Aunt Hannah Remembers. Aunt Hannah was not shocked at all when she awoke a short distance from the log building and found herself in a boudoir of a kind and character that few women of the world save Mother Eve have ever been known to occupy. Perhaps the mild manner in which she accepted the novel situation was due to the fact that her awakening was not occasioned by any sudden or violent experience in the course of her sleeping activities. Then she saw Hazel and Violet coming toward her, and a few moments later beheld all the other members of Flamingo Campfire approaching in the moonlight. She was not slow in recognizing where she was. "Have I been walking in my sleep, girls?" she inquired of the two who first came within speaking distance. "Tell me what has happened. What have I done?" Mrs. Hutchins appeared to be almost amused at the situation. "This is the second time you have walked in your sleep in the last 3 nights," Harriet said. "You appear to be interested in something in that building. You went in there tonight, removed a stone from the fireplace, and examined something that seemed to be hidden there." For the first time, the awakened sleepwalker was excited. "What's that you say?" she exclaimed. "Were you there? Did you see me? Come on and show me what I did." She led the way, and Harriet and Violet followed. They had not gone far when evidence of a struggle on the porch reached their ears and eyes. This did not stop Mrs. Hutchins, however, and the girls continued to follow her. They found Mr. Mackenzie holding his prisoner down and examining his pockets for a weapon, while Hazel aided him with her flashlight. "What does this mean?" Mrs. Hutchins inquired. "Why, that man is Percy Tyche, one of the pickpocket bandits. What were you doing here?" she asked, addressing her husband's nephew. "I know," Hazel answered for Tyche, who seemed undisposed to talk on any subject. "He was here after those hidden securities of which you are trustee. He had Uncle Edmund's letter in his possession and had deciphered enough of it at least to inform him that the paper were in this building. It was he who shot Mr. Anderson night before last while here looking for the papers." "Why, Hazel!" Aunt Hannah exclaimed excitedly. "Do you realize what you are telling me? I remember everything now. Where my husband told me that he had hidden the papers, I can put my hand right on the spot. Come on, I must get them at once. I can't wait an instant." "It's unnecessary, Auntie," Hazel returned. "I have them here in my hand. You did it in your sleep, and I got them after you went away. Then this man attacked me and took the box away." "How did you happen to be here, John?" Aunt Hannah inquired, addressing her farm manager. "Some of the cattle broke into the orchard, and while I was driving them out, you came along walking in your sleep, and I followed you," Mr. Mackenzie replied. "Let me prove to you that I remember now the secret that my husband gave to me on his deathbed and which I forgot," Mrs. Hutchins proposed. "Let me have your light, Hazel." She led the way into the hotel parlor or restroom and went direct to the fireplace. After a short examination of the stonework, she laid her hands on the loose boulder which she had removed a short time before and lifted it out of its place. The entire campfire was present by this time, and a period of explanations followed. Then all returned to their tents, while Mr. Mackenzie kept watch over his prisoner. Mrs. Hutchins, of course, took the long treasure box with her and insisted on examining its contents before she retired again. The examination proved satisfactory, so far as she was able to determine. The metal case contained a dozen or more mortgage bonds of large denomination and a number of other important papers. After assuring herself that she had indeed discovered the long-missing fortune of which she was the bonded trustee, she placed every paper carefully back into the box and closed it, and then got back into bed, taking the treasure with her and holding it close to her under the covers. Hazel fell asleep soon after she lay down, in spite of the wakeful happenings of the night. She was tired and sleepy, as it was quite natural for her to be under the circumstances, and moreover she had strong nerves and was capable of speedy recovery from shocking and thrilling experiences. When she awoke, it could not have been more suddenly. Her first consciousness was the realization that she was sitting up in bed, with the sound of a sharp explosion ringing in her ears. She was more than frightened, for the explosion seemed to have taken place right in the enclosure where she slept. Her first thought was that someone must have thrown a bomb into the tent. A moment later she decided this idea was foolish, but she was unable to think of a reasonable substitute. It was dark in the tent. Evidently the moon had gone down, for only the faintest rays of starlight came in through the openings in front and around the sides for the circulation of air. While Hazel was thus attempting to drive away the panic that had seized her and to get a view of her obscured surroundings, there came several more explosions in rapid succession outside the tent. At once she realized the nature of these noises, and in a moment was out of bed and beside her aunt's cot. With her hands she examined it. The covers had been tossed in a heap at the foot. The cot was empty. Chapter 24. Aunt Hannah Shoots. A great dread of some direful event held Hazel in a rigid position beside her aunt's cot for some moments, or minutes, she is unable to tell which. She was afraid to move, and yet duty told her that she ought not to be idle in this crisis, that if she were active and resourceful, she might be of important service to Aunt Hannah. But what could she do? With an effort she answered this question by proving that she could do something. She moved, and this mere moving was a great relief. She reached under her pillow for the searchlight which she always kept there at night, and was still further relieved. What could she do now, was her next question. She could look out of the tent and see, perhaps, what was going on. With a resolution to this effect in her mind, she secured the flashlight and went to the front of the tent and looked out. She saw nothing of interest, and was about to venture cautiously a little farther, when Aunt Hannah appeared suddenly before her, approaching around the northeast corner of the tent. "Oh, Hazel!" she exclaimed in great distress. "I've been robbed again. 2 men crept up to the side of the tent, and one of them reached in and took the box out of the cot beside me. I awoke just as they were getting away with it and grabbed my pistol and fired at them. Then I rolled out of bed and ran after them a distance of 20 or 30 feet. I could see their forms distinctly enough, I thought, and stopped and emptied all the rest of my cartridges at them. I think I hit one of the scoundrels, for he uttered an unmistakable curse of pain. Isn't this the worst piece of luck you ever heard of?" Hazel recalled the lecture her aunt had given her very recently on the subject of luck, and would have smiled and mildly rebuked the lecturer if the present situation had not been so serious. "Who were they? Have you any idea?" she inquired excitedly. "One of them was Percy Tyche, I feel certain," Mrs. Hutchins replied. "At any rate, one of them was a small man about Percy's size." "But how did he get away? Do you suppose he played a trick on Mr. Mackenzie and turned the tables on him?" "I can't figure it out," Aunt Hannah said dubiously. "It sure is a puzzle to me. Something serious must have happened. We really ought to go and find out. John may be seriously wounded and suffering. If Percy Tyche escaped, John must have got hurt. He wouldn't have let him go without a fight if he was in a position where he could fight." As she finished speaking, Harriet Newcomb and Violet Munday entered the tent to learn what had taken place. They were quickly informed, and then the 4 proceeded to the tents of the other girls to acquaint them with developments. All of them got up and dressed hurriedly, when informed that a relief excursion was about to be made to the abandoned hotel where Mr. Mackenzie had been left in charge of the prisoner. In a few minutes all were ready and the start was made. Realizing that one or more of the desperadoes might be in or near the building, they proceeded cautiously and without light. As they neared the front entrance, they heard a loud groan which sent such a chill through the girls that every one of them halted in awed apprehension of a vision of something dreadful. Aunt Hannah proved herself the most courageous of all in this crisis. "Don't be afraid, girls," she said. "That noise no doubt was made by Mr. Mackenzie. He's probably injured and we've got to steel ourselves to go to his rescue at once." "I'm not afraid to go," said Catherine Crane, stepping ahead courageously. "Nor I," said Violet Munday, whereupon this expression of bravery became a sort of slogan, and everybody repeated it. "I think it is safe enough to switch on our lights," Mrs. Hutchins said as a general movement forward was made. Accordingly, 15 tiny electric bulbs became brilliant, and 15 miniature floods of light were poured upon the porch as the party of rescuers ascended the steps. They were not long in finding the object of their search. He lay, bound and gagged, right in front of the entrance of the building. Apparently he was not seriously injured, if at all, for his eyes gazed up at them strongly and clearly. Mrs. Hutchins at once began a search through his pockets and soon produced a large jackknife, which she opened with her teeth, her thumbnails not being strong enough. Then she cut his bonds and removed the gag from his mouth. The farmer sat up, moved his stiffened limbs with difficulty a few moments, then managed to get onto his feet with the assistance of some of the girls. "What happened, John?" Aunt Hannah inquired. "How in the world did you ever get into such a predicament?" "Not through any of my own choosing, you can be dead certain," he said with a kind of vindictive bitterness. "But I met more than my match that time. I never was licked before in my life, but I sure was licked that time. He handled me just like a muscular washerwoman would handle her 4-year-old brat." "Who did, John? Tell me quick. We haven't any time to lose." "Why, that big fellow, of course," John replied fiercely. "The big fellow that created the big sensation with the little fellow on the square on the 4th. That was the biggest fake you ever heard of, as I've got good evidence to prove. They fooled me like hundreds of others to a frazzle. I thought it was on the square and would have bet money on it." "Do you mean to say that that big fellow was here with Percy Tice tonight?" Mrs. Hutchins gasped. "That's what I do mean to say," Mackenzie replied with energy. "He was here all right. I guess I ought to know, for I felt his bone and muscle. He gripped me like steel. The moon hadn't gone down yet and I could see his face plain enough. I got a good view of it, you see, on the 4th. He came up behind me while I was watching my prisoner and he took hold of me with a grip that would have crushed a granite tombstone. He threw me on my back and with one knee on my chest so pressed the life out of me that I couldn't make a sound, while he cut the ropes that bound my prisoner. Then they tied my hands and feet with the ropes that had been around Tice and shoved a gag in my mouth. They waited around here an hour or more until you folks was asleep and then went over to the camp and tried to rob you, I suppose. I heard the shooting and was pretty sure who was doing it. Did you wing either of 'em, Mrs. Hutchins? Did they get away with anything?" "I should say they did," Aunt Hannah replied desperately. "They got away with just what they came after. The box of securities that was recovered tonight after being lost ever since my husband's death. I don't suppose now that I will ever see them again." "You don't tell me," Mackenzie exclaimed. "That's too bad. But I couldn't have helped it if I'd seen that fellow coming and had an even catch with him. I tell you he's the most powerful fellow that ever struck these parts. Why, he could have done up that little fellow with a single swipe of his hand. It was all a put-up job. They had a good laugh of it under their breath, of course, while they was waiting for the moon to go down." "Well, let's go back to the tents and wait till morning," Mrs. Hutchins suggested. There's no use trying to do anything before daylight. That won't be long, thank goodness. It's after 3 o'clock now." So they returned to their tents, while Mr. Mackenzie remained in the abandoned hotel after arming himself with a large club and announcing his intention to ambush those tricky rascals if they returned again. "I'll get the big fellow first with one blow," he said, "and then I'll handle the other one with bare hands, believe me." Chapter 25. She Hit the Mark. Mrs. Hutchins and the Campfire Girls went back to bed, but there was little sleep for any of them before daylight. With the rising of the sun they were out again, and a tired and haggard company of feminine campers they were. There was little spirit in the camp. Every one of the campers felt as if she had lost out in the battle of life, and there was nothing more ahead of her but gloom. There was not one of the girls who did not love Aunt Hannah as if she had been a lifelong friend of hers. The burden of her loss was felt by the whole camp. Perhaps it was the dreadfulness of this new blow, and the suffering that it must inflict upon Mrs. Hutchins, that caused the girls to realize how great their affection for her had become in the few days most of them had known her. Nobody thought of breakfast for an hour or two after the last girl in bed had arisen. They gathered together in groups or all together and discussed the events of the night, but not one of them suggested a possibility that anything might turn up which would throw a more hopeful light on the actual resulting conditions. What was the use? The men had got possession of the treasure they sought, and the outlook for its recovery was poor indeed. At daybreak Mr. Mackenzie appeared at the camp and announced that he was going back to his house and telephoned to the sheriff information of the latest robbery. This seemed to be about all that could be done, and was the only hopeful feature of the conversation that followed his departure. More than an hour elapsed before any of the girls or Mrs. Hutchins thought of suggesting that they examine the trail left by the tent burglars in their departure. The suggestion arose as a result of a remark made by Catherine Crane. "If you shot one of those men," she said, "I'd like to have the satisfaction of knowing it. I wonder if we couldn't find a trail of blood on the ground. That might be worth something. The sheriff might like to know about it if such a trail exists." "It wouldn't run very far," Mrs. Hutchins said. "They no doubt stopped the flow of blood if one of them was wounded before they got very far. However, let's satisfy our curiosity and see what we can find." Mrs. Hutchins indicated the direction the men had taken, and all started out on a search. The ground was examined a distance of 50 yards from the tent, and sure enough, close to a spring rivulet which splashed down a rocky steep toward the main stream in the form of a miniature cascade, was found the beginning of a trail of foreign spots on the grass and weed leaves. These spots were almost of a dull brown now, as a result of their exposure to the atmosphere and chemical action between them and the vegetation on which they rested. All the girls rushed to the spot as Harriet Newcomb excitedly announced her discovery of the trail. As they were examining the spots to see in what direction they led, Violet Munday announced a new discovery in a manner that thrilled all present as nothing else could have done. "Oh, I've found it! I've found it!" she exclaimed, and the way she began to leap down the steep descent along the succession of tiny waterfalls was a sight to make one's heart throb in expectant unison. Nobody else saw the object of her interest until she reached it. 50 feet from the point where she began her descent, she stopped and leaned over and picked up what appeared to be the long metal box that had been recovered from the fireplace in the abandoned hotel in the course of the thrilling adventures of the night just past. "You shot the man who carried the box, and he dropped it and it fell down here," Violet explained in shrill tones. "The bullet must have hit him in the arm and made him drop the box, and they didn't dare stop to hunt for it because they were afraid of more bullets." That seemed the only solution, and months afterward, when the robbers were captured and forced to confess, it proved to be essentially true. But the treasure was not all in the box. As it tumbled down the hill, the lid had been knocked open, and most of the papers were scattered in all directions. Now began a diligent search for the bonds and other papers scattered along the course taken by the tumbling box. Most of them were soon discovered, but the search was continued several hours in order that none might be missed, as Mrs. Hutchins had no list against which to make a check and determine just what the box had contained. But at last they decided there was no good reason for hunting longer and returned to camp. It was breakfast time. Yes, long past breakfast time, after 9 o'clock. Hungry? They surely were, and had a right to be. There was no system about the preparation of the morning meal this time. Everybody got busy, and when at last they sat down, it would have been hard indeed to find a more deservingly happy company of tired and famished Campfire Girls. Next day Hazel had a long talk with her aunt over the events of the last few days. In the course of the conversation she said, "Do you remember, Aunt Hannah, that night before last, when our conversation was interrupted by that shooting, you were telling me how you walked in your sleep when you were a young girl, and you were at the place in your story where the springboard broke just as the first shot was fired. Who was the young man that rescued you?" "The man whom I subsequently married, your Uncle Edmund," Aunt Hannah replied. Near the end of their conversation, Hazel commented at length on the remarkable adventures the members of Flamingo Campfire had had, and expressed a wonder if they would ever go through other experiences as thrilling as recent ones had been. Doubtless her wonder would have been calmed very much if she could have looked ahead and caught but the faintest motion picture of new adventures in store for them before the close of the present summer season, which will be found presented in narrative form in another volume of this series entitled Campfire Girls at Twin Lakes, or The Quest of a Summer Vacation. End of Campfire Girls in the Country,